My name is Arianne Martin. I am 24 years old. Last winter, my own parents locked me inside a freezing Audi during a brutal Maryland storm, banning me from my grandmother's funeral. They stripped the heavy winter coat off my lap, pocketed the keys, and left me shivering in a thin black dress. My father leaned through the open door and whispered that if I shed a single tear and ruined his corporate image in front of his wealthy friends, he would cancel my apartment lease by nightfall. I sat alone watching the heavy cemetery gates close. I did not scream. I did not pound on the glass. Instead, I answered a phone call from my grandmother's estate attorney. By the time that short conversation ended, the trap my parents set for me had turned into their own grave. Before I take you back to that freezing coastal afternoon, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed a sterile blue, reading 38 degrees. The frost creeping up the inside of the windshield told a harsher story. The engine was dead. The heater sat useless. I pressed my bare arms against my ribs. The thin crepe fabric of my morning dress offered zero resistance against the chill seeping through the leather passenger seat. The interior of the luxury car smelled of rich leather and sharp mint air freshener, a scent that made my stomach turn. Just minutes earlier, Richard, the man I was supposed to call Dad, had leaned into the cabin. He unbuckled my seatbelt and yanked my wool peacoat away from my gripping fingers. The air rushing in from the open door tasted like salt and wet pavement. He leaned close enough for me to smell his expensive cedar cologne. "You are a liability today, Arianne," he whispered. His voice carried a smooth, practiced edge, devoid of any paternal warmth. "If you step out of this car and make a scene, if you embarrass me in front of the Commodore, you can find a new place to live. I will pull my name off your lease. You can fund your own life." He slammed the door. The electronic locks engaged with a heavy clack. At 24, my salary as an assistant historical archivist barely covered groceries, let alone rent in a prime Annapolis zip code. Richard knew this. He used that co-signature as a leash, keeping me quiet, keeping me compliant. I was trapped in a gilded cage of his design. Through the tinted glass, I watched the burial of the only person who ever truly raised me. A nor'easter punished the coastline, whipping the gray waters of the Chesapeake Bay into a frenzy and driving rain into the historic churchyard. Beneath a canopy of black umbrellas, Grandmother Beatrice's casket hovered over the wet earth. Richard and my mother Evelyn stood front and center. Neither bothered to glance back at the parked car. Richard wore a bespoke charcoal suit brushing off the storm, while Evelyn dabbed dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. They were working the crowd. Even standing beside his mother's grave, Richard shook hands, leaning in to whisper to men wearing tailored overcoats and heavy diving watches. These were prominent investors from the local yacht club. My breath plumed into white vapor. Every exhale bloomed into a cloud that clung to the window panes. My teeth began to chatter, a rhythmic clicking in the quiet cabin. I curled my numb fingers into fists. Beatrice deserved better. She was the woman who spent her summers teaching me how to harvest blue crabs off the end of a splintered wooden dock. Her hands were scarred and capable. She smelled of old paper and sea salt. She despised the sterile country club vanity my parents worshipped. Now they were turning her farewell into a networking event. I brought the heel of my palm to the frosted window, rubbing a small circle into the ice. The cold burned my skin, but it gave me a clear line of sight. Through my makeshift peephole, a strange exchange caught my attention. Richard slipped his smartphone from his pocket, typed a rapid message, and slid the device away. 50 yards removed from the mourners standing near the wrought iron gates, a man in a bright yellow windbreaker checked his own screen. The man looked up and met Richard's gaze through the rain and gave a single nod. A transaction quiet and calculated, executed over an open grave. It made no sense. Why would a grief-stricken son be coordinating with a stranger during the final prayers? The yellow fabric stood out like a warning sign against the bleak gray landscape. Hypothermia transitioned from a lingering threat to a physical reality. My joints stiffened. The cold settled deep into my bones, a heavy ache that made it hard to draw a full breath. I closed my eyes, pulling my knees to my chest to preserve whatever body heat remained. I tried to focus on the memory of Beatrice's warm kitchen, the smell of baking apples, but the biting temperature dragged me back to the present. Then the silence shattered. A sharp mechanical vibration buzzed against my thigh. I jumped, knocking my knee against the glove box. Reaching into the pocket of my dress, I pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated the dim interior, casting a pale glow over my shaking hands. It was an unknown local Maryland number. Nobody calls a family member during a funeral. People send texts or leave voicemails. A ringing phone meant urgency. My thumb hovered over the green icon. The wind howled against the metal frame of the Audi, rattling the doors. I swiped the screen and pressed the cold glass to my ear, not saying a word, just waiting for the voice on the other end to explain why they were calling a girl locked in a freezing car. I pressed the phone to my icy ear, my fingers stiff and aching. I did not offer a greeting. My jaw was locked so tight from the cold that speaking felt impossible. I just sat in the dim cabin, listening to the faint crackle of static. A voice broke through the speaker. It did not belong to a friend, a neighbor, or anyone from the yacht club. The tone was weathered, deep and rough like crushed gravel. It was the voice of a man who spent his life navigating the unforgiving legal channels of the Maryland coast. He told me his name was Silas Montgomery. He stated he was Beatrice's estate attorney. And then he said something that made the freezing air in my lungs catch. He told me he knew exactly where I was sitting. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning a pale, mottled white. I asked him how he could possibly know that. I glanced out the frosted window, scanning the gray cemetery, wondering if he was standing behind a gravestone watching me shiver. Silas let out a low, humorless exhale. He told me he was currently sitting at his mahogany desk in downtown Annapolis, miles away from the churchyard. He explained that he did not need to be present to see the board being played. He said my grandmother possessed a terrifying clarity regarding her own son. Beatrice knew Richard better than he knew himself. She understood his obsessive hunger for country club validation and his deep-seated resentment toward the rugged working-class life she built her legacy upon. Silas told me Beatrice predicted this exact scenario weeks before her heart finally gave out. She had sat in his law office, drinking black coffee, and mapped out Richard's probable actions with chilling accuracy. My grandmother told her attorney that Richard would turn her funeral into a grotesque networking event to impress his wealthy investors. More importantly, she warned Silas that my father would view my genuine grief as a threat to his stoic, curated image. She knew he would find a way to exclude me, to lock me out of the mourning process, ensuring his business partners saw only a composed, victorious patriarch. Hearing Silas speak those words sent a strange electric current down my spine. The biting chill inside the Audi seemed to lose its edge for a brief second. Beatrice had seen the trap being set long before I ever realized I was the prey. Even from the grave, she was watching over me. Silas issued his first directive. His tone was not gentle. It was a tactical command delivered by a general preparing a soldier for the front lines. He ordered me not to kick the dashboard. He told me not to pound my fists against the frosted glass and beg for entry into the churchyard. He said causing a scene in the parking lot would only hand Richard the exact ammunition he needed. The attorney laid out the psychology behind my father's cruelty. Richard wanted me to break down. He wanted me to step out of the vehicle, sobbing and screaming, so he could point to my reaction as proof of my instability. He needed to paint me as an erratic, hysterical daughter to justify cutting off my apartment lease and severing his financial ties. Silas instructed me to deny him that satisfaction. He told me the most dangerous thing a person can do to an arrogant man is let him believe he has won the game. He told me to sit quietly in the freezing vehicle and let my father perform his hollow pantomime of grief for the men in the tailored overcoats. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest. The logic was undeniable. The frantic, desperate urge to force my way out of the car began to dissolve, replaced by a hardened, stubborn focus. I took a slow, jagged breath asking Silas what I was supposed to do next. He told me the real battle was not happening in that wet cemetery today. It was happening tomorrow morning. Silas informed me that a mandatory reading of the will was scheduled for 10 o'clock in his downtown office. He stated, "My presence was not a suggestion. It was a strict legal requirement." Before I could ask about the details of the estate, Silas pivoted. He refused to discuss the financial assets over the phone, citing strict legal confidentiality. But he mentioned one specific item. He said Beatrice had entrusted him with a physical object shortly before her death, with explicit instructions to hand it to me. It was not a bank document or a property deed. Silas described it as a heavy, tarnished silver pocket watch. I remembered that watch. It used to sit on the scarred wooden desk in Beatrice's study overlooking the marina. The silver was dull with age, and the glass cover bore a long, thin scratch across the center. Silas paused, letting the silence stretch over the line. Then he revealed the most crucial detail. He told me the internal mechanism of the watch was broken. The ornate metal hands were permanently stuck, frozen in place, at exactly 3:14. I frowned, staring at the frosted windshield. I asked him why a broken pocket watch mattered. Silas did not explain. He simply told me that Beatrice never kept useless things. She did not leave me a sentimental trinket to gather dust on a shelf. He quoted her final words to him regarding the heirloom. "Time reveals the truth." He told me to memorize those numbers, 3:14. He promised to see me in his office at 10 sharp, advised me to conserve my body heat, and ended the call. I lowered the phone, setting it on the leather seat next to me. The dynamic of my imprisonment had fundamentally shifted. I looked out through the small, clear patch I had rubbed into the window. The black umbrellas were beginning to fold. The investors were shaking hands and walking toward their luxury vehicles. The man in the yellow windbreaker was already gone, vanished into the coastal fog. Richard and Evelyn turned away from the gravesite and marched across the wet grass toward the Audi. I reached up and wiped the freezing tears from my cheeks. My knuckles ached from the cold, but the violent, helpless shivering had stopped. A newfound, rigid composure settled over my posture. The bitter wind continued to howl, rattling the heavy doors, but the vehicle no longer felt like a suffocating trap. The despair that pinned me to the passenger seat burned away. I realized I was not a discarded victim locked in a freezing box. I was a soldier sitting in a bunker, waiting for the sun to rise. Beatrice had armed the trap and handed me the detonator. All I had to do was survive the next few minutes. The heavy lock mechanism clicked loudly. The passenger door swung open, bringing a harsh gust of biting winter air and the sharp scent of cedar cologne into the cabin. Richard stood in the open doorway, holding my wool peacoat in his hand. He looked down at me, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. He expected to find a ruined, weeping girl. He expected me to beg for the coat, to apologize for my emotions, to promise I would behave so he would not call my landlord. He stood there, waiting for the satisfying display of my submission. I did not give it to him. I slowly uncurled my legs and placed my feet flat on the floorboards. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not reach for the coat. I looked up and met his gaze. I kept my face entirely blank, draining every ounce of emotion, fear, and sorrow from my expression. I stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes. Richard faltered. The smug, victorious aura he carried over from the gravesite flickered. His brow furrowed in confusion. He shifted his weight, clearly unsettled by the dead silence. He held the coat out, his hand hovering awkwardly in the freezing air. I took the wool fabric from his grasp without saying a single word. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, buttoned it up to my chin, and turned my face forward, staring through the windshield. My father swallowed hard. The power dynamic in the vehicle had flipped in the span of 10 seconds. He realized his punishment had not broken me. It had forged something much harder. He closed the door, walking around to the driver's side with a stiff, hurried pace. He started the engine, the sudden roar of the heater filling the silence, unaware that the real storm was waiting for him in a wood-paneled law office tomorrow morning. The law office of Silas Montgomery occupied the second floor of a restored brick building overlooking the gray, churning waters of the Annapolis harbor. The interior felt like a relic from a different era, smelling of lemon wood polish, stale coffee, and decades of archived paper. I walked into the conference room and found Richard and Evelyn already seated at the long mahogany table. They did not carry the heavy, muted posture of grieving relatives mourning a matriarch. Instead, they radiated the polished, electric certainty of lottery winners waiting to claim a jackpot. Beside my father sat his corporate litigator, a man named Harrison. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit and possessed the unnerving, predatory stillness of a cornered shark. Evelyn sat to his right, smoothing the lapels of her pristine cashmere coat. I took the lone chair at the far end of the table, creating a deliberate physical distance. As I sat down, the overhead fluorescent light caught a brilliant flash of blue near my mother's face. My stomach turned a cold knot forming just below my ribs. Evelyn was wearing Beatrice's vintage sapphire earrings. The heavy silver clasps pinched her earlobes. My grandmother had not been in the ground for 24 hours, and my mother was already raiding her jewelry box, parading the heirlooms in public. It was a staggering display of premature greed, a visual confirmation of their true priorities. I kept my hands folded tight in my lap, remembering Silas's strict command from the freezing Audi to maintain absolute composure. Through the frosted glass wall of the conference room, I had a clear line of sight into the reception area. A man paced back and forth across the thin carpet, clutching a leather briefcase under his arm. He wore a bright yellow windbreaker. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the exact same man Richard had locked eyes with across the open grave during the nor'easter. He was not a mourner. He did not belong to our family or the local yacht club. The scattered pieces of the puzzle began to snap together in my mind. Richard was not just impatient to claim his inheritance. He was actively facilitating a commercial transaction. The historic marina Beatrice owned sat on 40 acres of untouched, prime Chesapeake Bay waterfront. It was a rare jewel of coastal real estate, unblemished by modern zoning and highly coveted by luxury condo developers. My father had brought the buyer directly to the will reading. He intended to sign over my grandmother's entire legacy the moment the ink dried on the probate forms, trading generations of history for a quick corporate payout. The sheer arrogance of his plan made the air in the small room feel thick and suffocating. Silas Montgomery entered the room a moment later. He wore a faded, elbows-patched tweed jacket that looked wildly out of place next to Harrison's expensive armor. The veteran attorney carried a standard manila folder and a battered leather briefcase. He took his seat at the head of the table, offering no polite pleasantries or empty condolences. Silas opened the thin manila folder and began to read. His voice carried the same rough, gravelly texture I had heard over the phone the day before. He moved swiftly through the legal boilerplate outlining the standard declarations of Beatrice's estate, the payment of outstanding medical debts, and the burial costs. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. A triumphant, easy grin spread across his face. He was waiting for the grand prize. Silas read the minor bequests first. He announced that I was to receive my grandmother's collection of hand-drawn antique nautical charts, a set of tarnished silver teaspoons, and the broken pocket watch he mentioned during our phone call. Richard let out a soft, mocking scoff that echoed in the quiet room. He looked down the table at me with open, stinging pity. He truly believed those minor sentimental trinkets were the full extent of my worth to the woman who raised me. He assumed Beatrice had adhered to the traditional hierarchy, leaving the coastal empire and the operational bank accounts entirely to her only son. The reading paused as Silas turned a crisp page in the folder. Evelyn seized the momentary silence. She shifted in her seat, leaning across the empty space between our chairs. The sharp, overpowering scent of her gardenia perfume invaded my space, masking the smell of the old books. She did not raise her voice. She brought her face close to mine and reached out, wrapping her manicured fingers around my left wrist. Her nails dug into my skin, a sudden sharp pressure designed to intimidate and control. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered, her tone laced with a smooth, practiced venom. When this reading is over, you will sign the waiver of contest without saying a word. If you drag this process out, if you try to claim a single dime of the estate, your father will ensure you never work in this state again." She knew exactly where to strike. As an assistant historical archivist, my entire career relied on grants networking and recommendations from the local Maryland historical societies. Richard sat on the funding boards for half of those organizations. His financial influence in Annapolis was sprawling. "We will pull your museum funding." Evelyn continued her grip, tightening on my pulse point. "We will ruin your professional reputation before you even finish your graduate degree. You will be blacklisted from every archive on the Eastern Seaboard. Nod if you understand." I looked down at her hand gripping my wrist. The vintage sapphire hanging from her ear caught the light again, a stolen prize dangling right in front of my face. The urge to pull my arm away to scream at her for wearing Beatrice's jewelry burned hot in my chest, but the memory of the freezing car anchored me. I did not nod. I did not flinch. I let the silence stretch, internalizing the abuse, letting the tension build to an unbearable peak. I kept my expression as frozen and unreadable as the windshield of the Audi. Evelyn scoffed, releasing my arm with a look of sheer disgust, as if touching me was a chore. She sat back, smoothing the front of her cashmere coat, confident she had secured my terrified submission. Silas Montgomery did not miss the exchange. His sharp eyes flicked from my bruised wrist up to Evelyn's smug face, registering the physical threat. He remained entirely unfazed. The veteran attorney closed the thin manila folder, the paper making a soft slap against the wood. Richard sat forward, uncrossing his arms, ready to claim the coastal empire. He looked over at Harrison, giving a subtle nod, preparing to signal the developer waiting in the lobby. The trap was set. My parents believed they held every card in the deck, controlling both the wealth and my future. Silas let the heavy silence linger for a few excruciating seconds. He reached up and slowly removed his wire-rimmed reading glasses, folding the arms deliberately and placing them on the polished mahogany. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and commanding, demanding the room's undivided attention. "That concludes the execution of the original will," Silas stated, his voice devoid of any sentimental inflection. Richard frowned, his triumphant grin faltering at the edges. He opened his mouth, raising a hand to ask about the real estate transfer, but Silas raised a single calloused finger to stop him. The attorney reached down into his battered leather briefcase resting on the floor. He did not pull out another standard legal document. He pulled out a second folder. This one was vastly thicker, bound tight with heavy black elastic bands. The thick cardboard cover was a stark, bright red. Silas placed the red folder onto the center of the mahogany table with a heavy thud. The sound echoed like a gavel strike in the quiet room. The smug certainty vanished from my parents' faces in an instant. Harrison narrowed his eyes, leaning forward, his predatory instincts sensing a sudden, dangerous shift in the current. Silas rested his hands flat on top of the red cover, his posture rigid and unyielding. The atmosphere in the conference room turned electric. Everyone stared at the bright cardboard, the visual shift demanding immediate focus. The inheritance Richard spent months planning to liquidate was no longer a guaranteed reality. The rules of the game had just shifted without warning. A new, unspoken question hung in the stagnant air, deafening in its intensity. What is in the red folder? Silas Montgomery did not rush. He let the heavy silence press down on the room, allowing the stark red cover of the folder to dominate everyone's attention. He reached out with calloused hands and snapped the thick black elastic bands holding the cardboard together. The sound echoed like a cracking whip. Harrison, the corporate litigator sitting next to my father, shifted his weight. The predatory stillness he carried into the meeting evaporated. Lawyers of his caliber recognize a trap when they see one, and the sheer volume of paper sitting inside that crimson binding signaled a legal maneuver of staggering complexity. Richard leaned forward, his tailored charcoal suit suddenly looking rigid and uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, attempting to project the same unyielding authority he had used to lock me inside the freezing Audi 24 hours ago. He demanded to know what Silas was doing. He insisted the original will had just been finalized and instructed the attorney to pass over the probate transfer forms so he could sign for the deed. Silas ignored him entirely. He opened the red cover, revealing a stack of dense, watermarked legal parchment. The document I just concluded was indeed your mother's original will, Silas stated, his rough voice dropping to a measured clinical register. However, a will only dictates the distribution of assets remaining in a personal estate at the exact time of death. 3 days before her heart failed, Beatrice initiated a profound restructuring of her holdings. Silas pulled the top page from the stack and smoothed it flat against the mahogany table. 72 hours prior to her passing, Beatrice filed a binding legal amendment. Silas continued, she executed a transfer of deed and established a separate legal entity. I am holding the official, finalized charter for the Beatrice Martin Irrevocable Trust. The word irrevocable hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Even with my limited legal knowledge as a historical archivist, I understood the gravity of that specific term. An irrevocable trust is a fortress. Once the ink dries and the notary stamps the page, the creator surrenders all ownership. The assets are locked inside a vault that cannot be altered, contested, or dissolved through standard probate court. The property bypasses the traditional inheritance process entirely. Richard's jaw slackened. The triumphant grin he wore a moment ago dissolved into a hollow mask of confusion. He glanced sideways at Harrison, seeking reassurance, but his high-priced lawyer was staring intently at the watermarked paper in Silas's hands, his expression grim. The trust dictates the immediate transfer of 3 primary assets. Silas read, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. First, the entirety of the 40-acre coastal estate situated on the Chesapeake Bay waterfront. Second, the historic commercial marina operating on that land. Third, an operational reserve account holding a liquid balance of $600,000. My breath caught in my throat. The numbers sounded fictional. $600,000 in liquid cash. I spent my days cataloging antique maritime journals for a salary that barely kept the lights on in my cramped apartment. I routinely skipped meals to ensure my rent cleared on time. The idea of possessing that kind of wealth felt entirely detached from reality. But the true prize was the land itself. The 40 acres of prime coastal real estate encompassed ancient pine forests, rugged tidal pools, and the deep-water marina where Beatrice had taught me to tie nautical knots. It was a sprawling, untouched sanctuary of Maryland history, and Richard had planned to sell it to the man in the yellow windbreaker waiting just outside the glass door. Silas turned to the second page of the charter. The trust outlines strict parameters for the management of these assets. Silas announced, raising his gaze from the paper. He looked past my parents and locked eyes with me. The trust designates a singular, exclusive trustee and sole beneficiary. All 40 acres, the historic marina, and the liquid reserve accounts are granted entirely to Arianne Martin. The room imploded into a chaotic, suffocating silence. Richard froze. The arrogant patriarch who had orchestrated my isolation at the cemetery, who had threatened to ruin my life over a single shed tear, ceased to function. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His chest stopped moving. He stared at Silas with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to process the terrifying reality that his own mother had legally bypassed him. His corporate vanity, the pristine image he spent decades cultivating, shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of his own legal counsel. He had brought a luxury condo developer to his mother's will reading, eager to sign a lucrative contract, only to discover he did not own a single grain of dirt to sell. Evelyn reacted with a sudden sharp gasp, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the conference room. Her pristine facade crumbled. The gardenia perfume she wore suddenly smelled sour, mixed with the sharp tang of cold sweat. She brought a trembling hand to her throat, her manicured fingers clawing at the collar of her cashmere coat. Her eyes rolled back, fluttering toward the ceiling. She lost all muscle control and slumped heavily to her right, her upper body collapsing against the polished mahogany table with a dull thud. As her head struck the wood, the heavy silver clasp of the vintage sapphire earring gave way. The stolen jewel slipped loose from her earlobe. It hit the table with a sharp, distinct, metallic click that echoed through the dead, silent room. The gemstone bounced twice before rolling across the polished surface, coming to a stop mere inches from my folded hands. It was a staggering display of poetic timing. The prize she had raided from a dead woman's jewelry box was now lying at the feet of the actual heir. Harrison did not reach out to help my mother. The corporate litigator instantly recoiled, physically pushing his expensive leather chair away from the table. He understood the lethal nature of the documents sitting in front of Silas. An irrevocable trust, executed by a lucid grantor with independent witnesses, was an impenetrable shield. There was no loophole to exploit, no clerical error to leverage. Harrison realized his client had zero legal standing, and he possessed the self-preservation instincts to distance himself from a sinking ship. I sat at the end of the table, staring at the blue sapphire resting on the wood. A profound, overwhelming surge of vindication washed over my exhausted body. The memory of sitting in the freezing passenger seat of the Audi, my teeth chattering while my father mocked my grief, felt like a distant nightmare. Beatrice had not just protected her legacy, she had handed me the exact weapon I needed to break the financial leash Richard held around my neck. Silas quietly gathered the documents, slipping them back into the crimson folder. He looked at me, giving a slow, subtle nod of approval. The tactical command he issued over the phone had worked flawlessly. By remaining silent and absorbing their threats, I allowed them to walk blindly into a trap they could not escape. I stood up from my chair. I did not gloat. I did not offer a sarcastic remark or rub the staggering victory in their faces. I simply pushed my chair in, turned my back on the chaotic scene, and walked toward the glass door of the conference room. As I reached the exit, I felt a heavy burning sensation drilling into the space between my shoulder blades. I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. Richard had snapped out of his paralyzed shock. The ashen gray of his complexion was gone, replaced by a dark mottled red. He was not looking at Silas, and he was not looking at his unconscious wife. He was staring directly at me. The shock had mutated. The arrogant businessman was gone, replaced by something feral and unhinged. His jaw locked, the tendons pulsing against his neck. The calculation in his eyes was terrifying. I realized in that split second that the war was not over. It had only just begun. A narcissist stripped of his prize does not simply walk away and accept defeat. They burn the surrounding earth to the ground. I held the deed to a coastal empire, but my father still possessed the co-signature on my apartment lease and the administrative ties to my current bank accounts. I stepped out of the law office, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, knowing the man I just defeated was already plotting how to destroy my life before the sun went down. The morning sun filtered through the cheap plastic blinds of my cramped apartment, casting thin strips of pale light across the worn hardwood floor. I woke up with a strange, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. The suffocating dread that had anchored me since the funeral was gone. I lay in bed, staring at the cracked plaster on the ceiling, replaying the moment Evelyn fainted and Richard lost his prized inheritance. Silas Montgomery had handed me a miracle. I was the sole trustee of an irrevocable trust. I owned a historic coastal estate, a deepwater marina, and a staggering operational fund. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. I reached for my cell phone on the nightstand, intending to buy a celebratory coffee before heading to the university archives. I tapped the screen and opened my mobile banking application. The loading icon spun for a few seconds. When the dashboard finally materialized, the lightness in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, leaden weight. My checking account balance read $0. My modest savings, accumulated through years of cataloging dusty maritime journals, also displayed a stark zero. In bold red lettering across the top of the screen, a banner flashed a sterile warning: "Account frozen, pending investigation." My heart kicked into a frantic rhythm. I tapped the alert, my thumb shaking against the glass. An automated message loaded, informing me that a formal complaint had been filed with the state authorities regarding my financial activities. I opened my email inbox and found a notification from the bank fraud department, sent at 2 a.m. Richard had not spent the night licking his wounds. He had executed a swift, surgical retaliation. He knew the Beatrice Martin Irrevocable Trust was a legal fortress he could not breach. So he attacked the only vulnerability I had left. My father had contacted Adult Protective Services and the local Maryland authorities, filing a formal, fabricated report of elder financial exploitation. He claimed I had coerced a dementia-riddled woman into signing over her estate during her final vulnerable days. The sheer cunning of the move was terrifying. Richard did not need to prove the accusation immediately. The mere existence of an elder abuse report triggers an automatic administrative freeze on the accused party's personal assets. It is a standard protective measure within the banking system, designed to halt any potential theft until a formal inquiry concludes. By picking up the phone and lying to a state agency, my father successfully locked me out of my own meager funds. A sharp, demanding knock echoed through my small living room, making me jump. I pulled on a heavy sweater and walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. A bright yellow sheet of paper was taped to the exterior wood, fluttering slightly in the drafty corridor. I pulled the tape loose and read the bold black print. It was a formal 10-day notice to quit the premises. The eviction notice detailed the immediate withdrawal of my primary guarantor. Richard had formally severed his co-signature on my lease agreement overnight. Without his financial backing, my scheduled rent payment, drawn from my newly frozen bank account, had bounced. The property management company, catering to a wealthy Annapolis demographic, did not offer grace periods to young tenants with frozen assets and missing guarantors. I had exactly 10 days to vacate the property or face forced removal by the county sheriff. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. My father was systematically dismantling my sanctuary. I needed to clear my head. I needed a cup of coffee and a moment to form a strategy. I grabbed my keys, walked out into the brisk morning air, and climbed into my rattling Honda Civic. I drove away from the apartment complex, steering toward a familiar stretch of the Annapolis docks. I parked outside a local crab shack, a weathered wooden building perched over the water. It was a neighborhood institution, smelling of steamed blue crabs, sharp vinegar, and Old Bay seasoning. Beatrice and I used to sit in the corner booth on Sunday afternoons, cracking crab claws and watching the fishing boats return to the harbor. It was a place that felt like home. The brass bell above the door chimed as I walked inside. The morning crowd consisted of local fishermen, dock workers, and a few well-dressed retirees from the nearby yacht club, sipping their early coffees. The low hum of comfortable conversation filled the room. As I stepped further into the dining area, the atmosphere underwent a chilling, immediate shift. A woman sitting near the window wearing a quilted vest, bearing the crest of my parents' country club, paused mid-sentence. She lowered her coffee mug and stared directly at me. The man sitting across from her turned his head, his expression hardening into a look of open disgust. The easy chatter died down, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. I walked toward the counter, my boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. I felt the weight of a dozen judgmental stares burning into my back. The bartender, a burly man named Thomas, who usually greeted me with a warm smile and asked about my archival studies, did not look up from the glass he was wiping. His jaw was set in a rigid line. I pulled a crisp $20 bill from my coat pocket, the last piece of physical cash I possessed. I slid it across the laminated counter and asked for a black coffee. Thomas stopped wiping the glass. He looked down at the money, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. There was no warmth left in his expression, only a profound, stinging disappointment. "Keep your money, Arianne," he said, his voice flat and loud enough for the patrons sitting nearby to hear. "We do not want it." I frowned, my hand hovering over the cash. I asked him what was wrong. A sharp scoff echoed from the booth near the window. The woman in the quilted vest stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face down here," she snapped, her tone dripping with righteous indignation. "Evelyn told us everything. She told the entire club how you isolated Beatrice, how you locked your own mother out of the hospital room and manipulated a sick, confused old woman into changing her will." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air in the crab shack evaporated. Richard had paralyzed my finances, but Evelyn had weaponized her social circle. My mother had spent the morning working the phones, twisting the narrative to paint herself as the tragic, victimized daughter. She projected her own crimes onto me. She convinced the tight-knit coastal community that I was a predatory, greedy grandchild who exploited a dying matriarch. I looked around the room. The local fishermen, the people Beatrice had respected and supported for decades, were glaring at me. They believed the lie. In their eyes, I was a monster who stole a legacy. I was a pariah in my own hometown. I did not try to defend myself. Pleading my innocence to a room full of people who had already convicted me in the court of public opinion was useless. I picked up my $20 bill, turned on my heel, and walked out the door. The brass bell chimed again, a mocking farewell, as I stepped back into the freezing coastal wind. I retreated to the safety of my car, locking the doors and resting my forehead against the cold steering wheel. My chest heaved as I struggled to process the sheer velocity of the destruction. The paradox of my situation was agonizing. I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal copy of the irrevocable trust Silas had given me. The thick paper felt heavy in my hands. On this document, I was a millionaire. I held the pristine deed to a sprawling 40-acre estate and a historic marina. I was the heir to an empire. Yet as I sat in my old Honda, I was practically destitute. The $600,000 operational fund tied to the trust was currently locked within the slow-moving machinery of the probate court, inaccessible for weeks, perhaps months. My personal accounts were frozen by a fabricated fraud investigation. My reputation was burned to the ground, and I was holding a 10-day eviction notice. My parents had engineered a flawless siege. They knew a piece of paper could not buy groceries, put gas in a car, or pay rent. They intended to starve me out, forcing me to break before the legal system could process my inheritance. I stared through the windshield at the gray, churning water of the Chesapeake Bay. The hunger gnawing at my empty stomach was a stark reminder of my immediate reality. I had no access to credit, no family to rely on, and no safe haven left in Annapolis. The polished academic world I inhabited was slipping through my fingers. I needed to find a way to generate untraceable cash, and I needed to do it before the sun went down. How was a newly minted millionaire supposed to survive the week without a single dollar to her name? I needed untraceable cash. The polished, quiet world of the university archives, with its climate-controlled rooms and delicate maritime journals, could not save me. My degrees and academic accolades were useless, while my Social Security number was flagged in a state database. The Annapolis harbor featured two distinct faces. There was the pristine, sparkling waterfront where my parents docked their luxury vessels, and then there were the industrial shipyards miles south of the city limits. I steered my rattling Honda Civic away from the yacht clubs and headed toward the rust and the grime. The shipyard was a sprawling labyrinth of corrugated metal warehouses, towering dry docks, and chain-link fences. It operated on a brutal around-the-clock schedule. I parked near a chain-link gate and walked toward a foreman barking orders over the roar of a diesel generator. I did not hand him a resume. I told him I needed immediate work and I needed to be paid under the table. He took one look at my pale face and my thin coat, scoffing before handing me a pair of thick, cracked rubber overalls and a heavy waterproof jacket. My shift began at midnight. The task was straightforward but grueling. I was assigned to a high-pressure washing crew responsible for stripping the hulls of commercial fishing trawlers pulled fresh from the water. The physical toll was immediate and punishing. I stood on a wet concrete slipway under the harsh glare of halogen floodlights. A freezing coastal rain fell in sheets, mixing with the relentless spray of the industrial power washer I gripped in my hands. The heavy hose vibrated with a furious energy, sending shockwaves up my arms and into my shoulders. I aimed the concentrated stream of water at the towering fiberglass hull of a trawler. The force peeled away thick layers of algae, stubborn barnacles, and toxic marine paint. The air grew thick with a noxious mist. The sharp chemical sting of industrial bleach burned my lungs, mingling with the heavy, rotting stench of dead sea life and diesel exhaust. My muscles screamed in protest within the first hour. By the third hour, I could no longer feel my fingers inside the stiff rubber gloves. I kept my head down and focused on the strip of clean, white fiberglass appearing beneath the grime. I refused to quit. Every square foot of scraped hull translated into the crumpled dollar bills I needed to buy food and keep the gas tank of my car full. When the shift finally ended at 6 a.m, the sky bled a bruised, dull purple. The foreman handed me $60 in cash. I stripped off the heavy rubber gear, my own clothes underneath damp with sweat and stray salt water. I walked back to my Honda Civic, my legs feeling like lead. I drove to the back corner of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, seeking a safe place to rest. The heater in my car rattled and hummed, pushing a weak stream of lukewarm air into the cabin. I bought a cheap black coffee and a dry bagel with my wages, consuming them behind the steering wheel. I locked the doors, reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and pulled a thin, scratchy blanket over my chest. Sleep did not come easily. The cold seeped through the floorboards, chilling the cramped interior. My joints ached with a deep, throbbing pain. The absurdity of my situation pressed down on me. I held the legal title to a waterfront empire, yet I was shivering in a compact car smelling of bleach and marine rot. As my exhaustion finally overpowered the cold, the harsh sounds of the parking lot faded. The biting scent of the shipyard dissolved, replaced by the rich, earthy aroma of salt marsh grass and damp summer soil. I drifted into a memory, vivid and warm. I was 10 years old again, standing knee-deep in the thick, black mud of the Chesapeake Bay shoreline. The sun beat down on my shoulders, casting bright, glittering reflections across the shallow water. Beside me stood Beatrice. She wore tall rubber waders and a faded canvas hat, her silver hair tucked away from the breeze. She held a heavy wooden clipboard recording data, while I dragged a fine mesh net through the murky water. We were cataloging indigenous oyster beds, tracking the health of the local ecosystem. I pulled the net up, revealing a cluster of rough gray shells covered in thick sludge. I grimaced, holding my mud-caked hands away from my body. I complained about the dirt, whining that the dark slime was ruining my favorite bright yellow sneakers. I told her I wanted to go back to the country club pool where the water was clear and clean. Beatrice stopped writing. She set her clipboard on a dry rock and waded over to me. She did not coddle me or apologize for the mess. She reached out with her weathered, calloused hand and gently wiped a smear of black mud from my cheek. Her eyes held a fierce, grounded wisdom. "The mud washes off, Gracie," she said, using the private nickname she reserved only for me. "It is just proof of an honest day of work. You can scrub the dirt from your hands, but selling your soul stains forever. Never trade your grit for an easy, clean life." The memory washed over me, a warm current, pushing against the freezing reality of my car. I woke up hours later, the midday sun struggling to pierce the thick cloud cover. My neck was stiff and my hands were blistered and raw. I looked down at my palms. The manicured, archival hands of a graduate student were gone. In their place, red calluses were beginning to form along my fingers. I traced the rough skin with my thumb. The shame of my current exile vanished. I was not a victim hiding in a parking lot. I was enacting the exact resilience Beatrice had tried to teach me in that muddy water 14 years ago. The physical torment of the shipyard was a badge of honor. It was a visceral, active rejection of Richard's bespoke suits and Evelyn's stolen cashmere. They built their lives on hollow optics and exploited wealth. I was building my survival on grit. I started the engine of the Civic, a renewed determination settling into my chest. I would work the high-pressure hose every single night if it meant holding the line until the trust cleared. I found a harsh, calloused rhythm in the struggle. I was surviving. I shifted the car into gear, preparing to drive to a public park to wash the smell of bleach from my skin before my next shift. Then the phone buzzed in the center console. I glanced at the screen. Silas Montgomery. I picked up the device expecting an update on the fraud investigation or a timeline for unlocking the operational funds. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, greeting the attorney with a steady voice. Silas did not offer a greeting in return. The low, tactical confidence he usually projected was absent. His voice sounded thin, tight, and urgent. He told me to come to his office immediately. He ordered me to drop whatever I was doing and drive straight to downtown Annapolis. I asked him what had happened, my pulse quickening at the grim tone of his request. Silas let out a harsh breath. He explained that Richard had not just frozen my personal bank accounts. While we were focused on defending my reputation and surviving the eviction, my father's corporate litigator had unearthed a buried financial landmine. Silas had spent the morning reviewing a stack of archaic property records tied to the historic marina. The attorney told me my father had left a hidden trapdoor in the foundation of the estate years before Beatrice even drafted the irrevocable trust. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I asked Silas to explain. He stated that the physical exhaustion I was enduring meant nothing now. A new legal hurdle had just materialized, moving with blinding speed. Silas warned me that unless we found a way to counter this hidden maneuver, the trust, the 40 acres, the marina, and the entire legacy Beatrice fought to protect would be wiped out before the end of the month. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of Silas Montgomery's law firm. The receptionist, usually a model of polite professionalism, wrinkled her nose as I walked past her desk. I knew exactly why. My clothes reeked of industrial brine, dead algae, and the sharp chemical tang of commercial bleach. I had not slept. I wore the same damp jeans and heavy work boots from my midnight power washing shift. I did not stop to apologize for the mess. I walked straight into the back office, leaving a faint trail of damp footprints on the plush carpet. Silas stood behind his desk. He did not wear his usual tweed jacket today. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his tie loosened around his collar, projecting an aura of frantic, grueling labor. He gestured toward the leather chair opposite him. I sat down, resting my raw, blistered hands on my knees. The contrast between my battered physical state and the sterile, polished legal environment felt jarring. I asked him what Richard had done. Silas opened a thick manila folder, pulling out a stack of dense financial records. He did not sugarcoat the reality. He explained that my father's pristine corporate image was a carefully constructed mirage. His luxury boat dealership, the crown jewel of his country club status, had been hemorrhaging cash for years. To cover the shortfalls and maintain his elite lifestyle, Richard needed an immediate influx of capital. His personal credit was severely overextended, his accounts drained. Facing ruin, my father looked toward his mother's untouched, debt-free estate. Silas slid a prominent bank document across the polished mahogany. It was a commercial equity line of credit secured directly against the historic marina. The principal amount read $250,000. At the bottom of the page, Beatrice's signature looped across the dotted line in dark blue ink. I stared at the handwriting. The looping letters looked perfect, but the context was impossible. I told Silas my grandmother never would have leveraged her sanctuary to bail out her son's vanity project. She despised debt. She operated the marina strictly on a cash basis, refusing to owe the banking system a single dime. Silas nodded grimly, confirming my suspicion. Beatrice did not sign the contract. Richard forged her signature. He bypassed the standard notary protocols by leveraging his social connections at a friendly local branch of the regional bank. He secured the cash, sank it into his failing dealership, and subsequently stopped making the monthly payments long before Beatrice passed away. The account was now severely delinquent. Silas produced a second piece of paper, setting it beside the forged contract. It was a formal, expedited notice of foreclosure. The bank did not care about the ongoing probate dispute or the newly revealed irrevocable trust. They held a signed legal document tethered directly to the physical deed of the property. Silas laid out the brutal truth. We could file a civil suit proving the signature was fraudulent, but untangling federal bank fraud required years of slow, agonizing litigation. The commercial lending institution operated on a much faster, ruthless timeline. They were preparing to seize the 40 acres and auction the land to recoup their losses. I felt a hollow ache form in my chest. The estate was slipping away through a back door my father had built in secret. I leaned back in the leather chair, rubbing my aching temples. I reasoned aloud that losing the land was a profound tragedy, but at least I would walk away clean. I could start my life over. I could survive losing an inheritance I never expected to receive in the first place. Silas stopped shuffling his papers. He looked up, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated grimness. He told me walking away was no longer an option. He slid a third page across the desk. It was an addendum to the original loan application. He instructed me to read the secondary borrower information. I scanned the typed text. My breath hitched, trapping the oxygen in my lungs. There, printed in stark black ink, was my full legal name. Right below it sat my private Social Security number, followed by my date of birth. I stared at the numbers, a high-pitched ringing sound starting in my ears. The edges of my vision blurred. I asked Silas how this was mathematically possible. I was 18 years old when this loan originated, barely a freshman in college, living in a dormitory. I had never stepped foot inside a commercial lending office. Silas explained the trap with chilling clarity. Richard had utilized my childhood financial details, the identical information he controlled as my college guarantor, to add me as a secondary co-signer on the commercial debt. He tethered my identity to his fraud to secure a lower interest rate, banking on my clean, untouched credit history. The implications crashed over me like a physical wave. If the bank foreclosed on the historic marina, the fallout would not stop at the property line. The default would trigger a catastrophic cascade onto my personal record. Silas spelled out the consequences. A $250,000 commercial default would permanently obliterate my credit score. The bank would pursue me relentlessly for the outstanding deficiency balance. My future wages would be garnished indefinitely. Any hope of securing a new apartment, financing a reliable car, or passing a background check for a historical archive position would vanish instantly. Worse, because the loan was fraudulent, I could be swept into a federal investigation, forced to hire expensive defense attorneys to prove I was not a willing participant in my father's corporate crimes. My father had not just stolen my inheritance. He had handcuffed me to a sinking ship, ensuring that if he went down, I would drown right alongside him. The stakes had instantly doubled. This was no longer a battle over a piece of inherited coastal real estate. I was fighting for my actual freedom. I asked Silas how much time we had before the bank seized the deed and triggered the default. The veteran attorney picked up a red pen and tapped the tip against his desk calendar. A specific date, merely 2 weeks away, was circled in thick crimson ink. He told me the public auction was scheduled for the first of the month. I had exactly 14 days to cure the delinquency. I needed to hand a lending officer a certified cashier's check for $250,000, or the hammer would fall. Silas added a final sickening detail to the equation. He revealed that the bank auction was largely a formality. The luxury condo developer, the man in the bright yellow windbreaker I saw lurking at the cemetery during the funeral, had already placed a quiet, preemptive bid with the lending officers. He was circling the property like a vulture, waiting for the clock to run out so he could bulldoze the ancient pine trees and pave over Beatrice's legacy. If I missed the deadline by a single hour, the developer would claim the land and the bank would unleash their debt collectors on my shattered future. I walked out of Silas Montgomery's office in a daze. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, cutting off the quiet sanctuary of the law firm. The late afternoon sun cast long gray shadows across the brick sidewalks of Annapolis. I climbed back into my Honda Civic, the stench of bleach and marine rot clinging to my jacket, a sharp reminder of my current station in life. My raw, blistered hands gripped the steering wheel. I stared blindly through the windshield, running the horrific math in my head. The numbers mocked my exhaustion. Earning $250,000 in 14 days was an impossibility. I could wash commercial boat hulls every hour of every day until my fingers bled to the bone, and I would not earn a fraction of the required capital. I was trapped in a financial vice, suffocating under the weight of a debt I never authorized. I shifted the car into gear, steering toward the industrial shipyard for another agonizing night shift. The despair settled onto my shoulders, a tangible, crushing weight. My emotional armor was cracking under the sheer velocity of the attacks. I did not know how much more pressure my mind could withstand before breaking entirely. I needed a miracle. I needed a way out. And my parents, waiting in the shadows of the Annapolis docks, knew exactly when to exploit that desperation. The rhythm of the shipyard became a grueling sensory nightmare. For 3 consecutive nights, I existed in a haze of freezing water, noxious chemicals, and unrelenting physical pain. My muscles cramped, locking up the moment I stepped away from the high-pressure hose. My blistered hands throbbed a steady, agonizing pulse, the skin cracked and bleeding from the constant exposure to industrial bleach. The 14-day deadline Silas had outlined loomed over me like a guillotine. The weight of the impending $250,000 debt suffocated my every thought. The sleep I managed to steal in the cramped back seat of my Honda Civic was brief and plagued by visions of bank collectors seizing my future. It was 4 a.m. when the foreman finally yelled over the roar of the diesel generators, signaling the end of my shift. The sky above the Chesapeake Bay was a dark, impenetrable slate, promising another day of bitter coastal rain. I stripped off the heavy, brine-soaked rubber overalls, dropping them onto the wet concrete. My own clothes underneath felt damp and heavy. I walked across the massive, poorly lit industrial lot, my boots dragging against the cracked asphalt. I reached for the door handle of my Civic, anticipating the weak, rattling heat of the engine. A sudden movement in the periphery of my vision made me pause. A sleek, black luxury SUV was parked in the empty space directly next to my battered car. Its tinted windows were rolled up, obscuring the interior, but the engine hummed with a quiet, expensive purr. The stark contrast between the immaculate vehicle and the rusted metal of the commercial shipyard was jarring. The passenger side door pushed open. Evelyn stepped out into the biting wind. My mother pulled her thick, tailored camel hair coat tight against her chest, shivering instantly. She looked out of place, an elegant ghost haunting a graveyard of commercial trawlers. A second later, Richard emerged from the driver's seat. He wore a heavy wool peacoat over his bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. He did not look like a man facing financial ruin or a federal fraud investigation. He projected a calm, measured authority. I stepped back, my exhausted mind struggling to process the ambush. I asked them how they found me. Richard did not answer. He slowly walked around the front of his vehicle, his expensive leather shoes stepping carefully to avoid the oil slicks pooling on the asphalt. He looked at my pale, exhausted face. He took in my damp clothes, my cracked hands, and the unmistakable smell of dead algae clinging to my skin. His gaze swept over the rusted exterior of my Honda Civic, registering the makeshift bed I had constructed in the back seat. He absorbed the totality of my suffering, and his expression softened. The cold, unyielding patriarch who had locked me inside a freezing car at a funeral vanished. In his place stood a concerned, magnanimous father extending a bridge across troubled waters. "This has gone far enough," Arianne Richard said, his voice surprisingly gentle, carrying a paternal warmth I had not heard in years. "Look at yourself. Look at how you are living. You are destroying your health over a stubborn point of pride." He stepped closer, bridging the physical gap between us. The scent of his cedar cologne briefly overpowered the stench of the shipyard. Evelyn moved to his side, wrapping her arms around her own torso. She did not wear the vintage sapphire earrings tonight. Her eyes looked tired, carrying the weight of a manufactured sorrow. "Please, Gracie," she pleaded, using the nickname she rarely employed, her voice trembling slightly in the cold air. "Stop this silly war. You do not belong out here in the dirt. Come back to your apartment. We can fix all of this." The sudden shift in their demeanor was jarring. The psychological whiplash disoriented my exhausted brain. They were playing the roles of benevolent saviors, offering a rescue from the brutal reality they had intentionally engineered. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his wool coat. He pulled out a crisp, stark white envelope, holding it out toward me in the dim light of the halogen parking lamps. He laid out the terms of his surrender with the polished delivery of a seasoned corporate negotiator. He promised to call the property management company and reinstate his guarantee on my lease before the sun rose. He swore he would contact the state authorities and drop the false elder abuse investigation, instantly unfreezing my personal bank accounts. He promised to make the pain stop. Then he revealed the contents of the envelope. He stated it held a certified cashier's check made out to my name for exactly $50,000. He called it a gesture of good faith, a generous cash stipend to secure my future, pay off my student loans, and ensure I never had to scrub another boat hull again. He asked for only one minor concession in return. "The historic marina is a toxic asset," Arianne Richard said, smoothly tapping the white envelope against his palm. "The debt is insurmountable. The bank is going to auction it anyway. Sign a simple quitclaim deed, surrendering your trustee rights over to me. Let me handle the messy corporate fallout. Take the money, go back to your quiet academic life, and let the adults clean up Beatrice's mess." I stood frozen on the cracked asphalt. The psychological trap was flawless. It was a perfectly constructed, suffocating vice, designed to exploit my physical breaking point. The temptation to accept the envelope crashed over me with terrifying force. My muscles screamed for rest. My blistered hands throbbed. The thought of fighting a massive regional bank, navigating federal fraud charges, and enduring another week of abject poverty felt like an impossible mountain to climb. The $50,000 represented a golden ladder, a chance to climb down from the freezing execution block and return to the safety of my quiet archives. I looked at Evelyn. She nodded encouragingly, a strained, hopeful smile playing on her lips. She was offering me a return ticket to the comfortable, oblivious life I had lost. My arm felt heavy as I slowly reached out. My raw, trembling fingers hovered inches away from the crisp white paper. Richard watched my hand. A subtle shift occurred in his expression. The concerned paternal warmth fractured for a microscopic second. A small, tight, victorious smirk crept onto his face. It was the exact same arrogant look he wore when he pocketed my car keys during the nor'easter. He believed he had finally broken me. He believed the working-class grit Beatrice had tried to instill in me had shattered under the pressure of his financial strangulation. That tiny, arrogant smirk triggered a massive internal alarm. The fog of exhaustion lifted, replaced by a sharp, crystalline clarity. Richard was not offering me a rescue. He was offering me a bribe to finance his own salvation. The math did not align. A man facing imminent bankruptcy and a $250,000 foreclosure does not possess a spare $50,000 in liquid cash to hand his estranged daughter in a dark parking lot. The money was a phantom, an illusion dangled in front of a starving teenager. The revelation hit me with sickening force. Richard had not secured that cashier's check from his own depleted accounts. He had secured it from the luxury condo developer. The man in the yellow windbreaker was bankrolling the bribe. Richard needed my signature on the quitclaim deed to deliver clean, unencumbered title to the developer. He intended to flip the 40 acres instantly, using the massive corporate down payment to pay off the forged bank loan, satisfy his failing dealership debts, and hand me my pathetic payoff. He was using the destruction of Beatrice's legacy to finance my bribe. I did not pull my hand back. I closed my raw fingers around the thick white envelope and slid it out of his grasp. Richard's smirk widened into a full grin. He exhaled a long, satisfied breath, believing the war was finally over. He reached into his coat pocket again, producing an elegant silver pen and a folded legal document, eager to finalize the surrender on the hood of my car. I did not take the pen. I took a slow step backward, clutching the envelope tightly against my damp jacket. "I need to read the fine print in a well-lit room," I said, keeping my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I will review the contract tonight." Richard frowned, the victory faltering. He opened his mouth to protest, insisting the deal required immediate execution, warning that his generosity had an expiration date. I did not give him the chance to argue. I turned my back on them, unlocked my rattling Honda Civic, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, hitting the locks before he could grab the handle. I started the engine, the loud mechanical roar drowning out his sudden angry shouts. I put the car in reverse, backed out of the parking space, and sped out of the industrial shipyard, leaving my parents standing alone in the bleak, freezing dawn. I did not drive back to my empty apartment. I did not drive to the grocery store parking lot to sleep. I steered my car onto the highway, heading straight for downtown Annapolis. I had not surrendered. I had executed a calculated theft. The envelope sitting on my passenger seat was not a peace treaty. It was a loaded weapon. Richard, in his desperate arrogance, had just handed me a legally drafted document connecting his personal finances directly to the luxury developers. I parked outside Silas Montgomery's law firm just as the sun crested the horizon. I walked up the stairs, gripping the envelope. I was about to turn my father's red herring into an actionable piece of evidence, unaware that his legal team was simultaneously preparing an attack designed to destroy my mind before I could strike back. I dropped the crisp white envelope onto Silas Montgomery's desk just as the morning sun hit the window glass. The veteran attorney looked up from his legal pads, taking in my disheveled appearance. He opened the unsealed flap and slid the drafted quitclaim deed out onto the blotter. He scanned the fine print, his eyes darting across the paragraphs. A grim, satisfied nod confirmed my suspicion. The document listed the primary financial beneficiary of the transfer, not as Richard, but as a corporate holding company directly tied to the luxury developers. I told Silas my father had handed me the proof of his own collusion. We had the leverage to expose his backdoor deal. Before Silas could form a strategic response, a heavy knock rattled the frosted glass door of his office. The receptionist stepped inside, looking deeply uncomfortable. She held a thick stack of legal documents bound with a blue cover sheet. She explained that a court-appointed process server had just dropped them off at the front desk, demanding immediate delivery. Silas took the stack, his brow furrowing. He flipped to the first page, and the brief glimmer of hope we shared evaporated into the stale office air. He looked up at me, the lines around his mouth deepening. He explained that Richard was not relying solely on the parking lot bribe. My father had launched a secondary, devastating legal strike simultaneously. He had filed an emergency injunction with the county court, petitioning to have me declared mentally unfit to serve as the trustee of the estate. I sat down heavily in the leather guest chair. I asked how he could possibly prove I was insane. Silas read the bullet points of the petition aloud. Richard had weaponized my survival tactics. The filing cited my recent eviction, my erratic behavior, and the fact that I was currently sleeping in a rusted vehicle in commercial parking lots. He attached the pending state investigation regarding the elder abuse allegations, painting a picture of a delusional, transient young woman suffering from a severe psychological break. The trap was terrifying in its circular logic. Richard froze my accounts to make me homeless, and now he was using my homelessness as legal proof of my mental incompetence. Silas closed the blue folder. He told me the judge had granted an expedited discovery phase due to the severe financial stakes of the trust. A mandatory recorded deposition was scheduled for that exact afternoon. I had no time to sleep, no time to shower, and no time to prepare. I had to walk into an interrogation room and prove my sanity to a predatory lawyer running on 0 hours of rest and a diet of stale coffee. 3 hours later, I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room in a neutral downtown law firm. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone, chilling the sweat drying on my skin. Across the polished mahogany table sat Richard and his corporate litigator, Harrison. A court reporter sat silently in the corner, her fingers hovering over a steno machine, ready to capture every syllable. Richard wore a fresh, immaculate suit. He looked well-rested and entirely unbothered. He did not look at me directly, choosing instead to gaze at the blank wall, playing the role of the heartbroken parent forced into a tragic legal corner. Harrison opened his leather portfolio. He possessed the cold, detached precision of a surgeon operating without anesthesia. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He utilized a smooth, condescending tone designed to strip away my dignity, layer by layer. He started with my living arrangements. He asked me to state my current residential address for the official record. When I refused to answer, he pressed harder, asking if it was true I was residing in a 2012 Honda Civic. He asked me to detail my bathing habits. He inquired about the foul chemical odor currently lingering in the conference room, forcing me to admit under oath that I was performing manual labor at an industrial shipyard. Every question was a calculated needle sliding under my skin. He was building a narrative for the judge, showcasing a filthy, unstable woman entirely incapable of managing a historic 40-acre estate. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, hiding the raw, bleeding blisters. I followed the instructions Silas had whispered to me in the hallway. I kept my answers short. Yes, no, I do not recall. Harrison recognized my defensive posture and pivoted his attack. He moved away from my poverty and targeted my relationship with Beatrice. He leaned across the table, tapping an expensive silver pen against his legal pad. He asked me to describe the final weeks of my grandmother's life. He painted a fabricated, grotesque picture of a frail woman suffering from severe cognitive decline. He suggested Beatrice spent her final days terrified, confused, and isolated from her loving son. Harrison looked me dead in the eye and asked if I enjoyed taking advantage of a dying woman. He asked if I felt any remorse for manipulating a dementia-riddled mind just to fund my transient lifestyle. A hot, suffocating flush crept up my neck. My heart hammered against my ribs, pumping pure adrenaline through my exhausted veins. I bit the inside of my cheek, bearing down so hard that the sharp metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. I swallowed the blood, fighting the visceral urge to defend the woman who raised me. I told myself to hold the line. I told myself a written transcript would not capture my silence. But Harrison was relentless. He did not let the silence breathe. He smiled, a thin, cruel curvature of the lips. He stated for the record that Beatrice's beloved historic marina was nothing more than a rotting pile of wood, a toxic asset that she was too senile to manage. He claimed my grandmother died a broken, delusional woman, afraid of the very granddaughter who locked her away from her family. The armor cracked. The sheer physical weight of the sleep deprivation, combined with the agonizing insult to Beatrice's memory, snapped the final thread of my restraint. I lost control. I slammed both of my blistered hands flat onto the polished mahogany. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the sterile room, causing the court reporter to jump in her seat. I pushed my chair back, the legs screeching against the carpet, and leaned over the table. My voice tore from my throat, raw, jagged, and fueled by a feral, unpolished grief. I screamed at the litigator. I told him my grandmother had more mental clarity and rugged integrity in her final, failing breath than my father possessed in his entire hollow life. I pointed a shaking, calloused finger directly at Richard. I shouted that he treated his own mother's death like a cheap real estate transaction. I yelled that he was a coward, a fraud, and a parasite who forged loans and locked his daughter in freezing cars just to save his fragile ego. Tears of pure, blinding frustration spilled over my eyelashes. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving, the metallic taste of blood still lingering on my tongue. The room fell dead silent, save for the rapid, frantic clicking of the court reporter's steno machine. Harrison did not flinch. The cruel smile returned wider and more satisfied this time. He did not need to ask another question. I had just handed him exactly what he wanted. I had delivered a passionate, unhinged, hysterical outburst on the official legal record. Silas Montgomery stood up immediately, his chair slamming into the wall behind him. He raised his hand, cutting off the room with a sharp, booming command. He declared the deposition suspended, citing his client's physical exhaustion. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm and unyielding, and pulled me out of the conference room before I could inflict any more damage to my own case. Silas marched me down the hallway and shoved me into a small, empty break room, closing the heavy wooden door behind us. The sudden quiet pressed against my ringing ears. I leaned against the counter, covering my face with my trembling hands. The fierce adrenaline that fueled my screaming match evaporated instantly, leaving me hollow and deeply ashamed. I realized the catastrophic mistake I had just made. Silas poured a cup of lukewarm water from a plastic pitcher and set it on the counter. He looked at me with a harsh, unblinking pragmatism. He did not offer comforting platitudes. He explained the brutal reality of the justice system. He told me the probate judge would read the typed transcript tomorrow morning. The black and white paper would not capture Harrison's cruel sneer or Richard's arrogant smugness. It would only document a screaming, erratic young woman threatening a lawyer and launching wild, unsubstantiated accusations at her grieving father. Silas warned me that passion cannot beat perjury in a court of law. Emotional outbursts do not win legal wars, they lose them. He stated plainly that we were losing the war of optics. If we walked into the injunction hearing relying on my word against my father's polished performance, the judge would strip my trustee rights and hand the estate directly back to Richard. I stood in the break room sipping the stale water, reckoning with my own failure. The 14-day foreclosure deadline was still ticking. The luxury developer was still waiting in the wings. And now I had handed my father the very ammunition he needed to legally bury me. I stared at the blank wall, the suffocating despair pulling me under. I told Silas we had nothing left. We had no money to fight, no reputation to leverage, and no way to prove Beatrice was of sound mind. The veteran attorney reached into his jacket pocket. The grim expression on his face shifted, replaced by a dark, calculated resolve. He told me I was wrong. We did have something left. We had the one thing my father could not forge or manipulate. Silas pulled his hand from his pocket and placed a heavy, tarnished silver object onto the break room counter. It was the broken pocket watch he had mentioned during the nor'easter. The hands were permanently frozen at 3:14. The time had come to find out what truth the dead were keeping hidden. The fluorescent lights of the break room hummed a steady, irritating pitch. I stared at the tarnished silver pocket watch resting on the laminate counter. The heavy metal casing was dull with age, deeply scratched across the convex glass covering the dial. It was a beautiful, archaic piece of machinery, but it offered no practical solution to the impending bank foreclosure or the disastrous deposition I had just ruined. I picked up the heavy instrument, turning it over in my calloused hands. The physical weight of my failure settled deep into my bones. I told Silas the watch was useless. I was broke, exhausted, and on the verge of being legally declared insane by my own father. A broken heirloom could not pay the $250,000 debt, and it certainly could not convince a judge that Beatrice was of sound mind. I was ready to surrender. The fight had drained every ounce of my resilience. I placed the watch back onto the counter, my voice cracking with bitter defeat, telling him the luxury developers had won. Silas Montgomery did not argue. He did not offer a motivational speech about perseverance. He simply leaned against the counter, crossed his arms over his tweed jacket, and repeated Beatrice's final instruction. "Time reveals the truth," Silas said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "She did not leave you a sentimental paperweight, Arianne. Look at the numbers." I frowned, picking the pocket watch back up. I traced the cracked glass with my thumb. The ornate, oxidized metal hands were permanently frozen locked, precisely at the 3 and the 14-minute mark. The numbers meant nothing to me. They represented a random moment in history when the internal gears had finally ground to a halt. I shook my head, frustration mounting. I told him 3:14 was just a time on a broken clock. Silas pulled a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his jacket and slid it toward me. It was a certified copy of Beatrice's official Maryland death certificate. He tapped his thick index finger against the typed text located in the bottom right corner of the document. My eyes followed his finger. The line detailed the official time of death recorded by the attending hospice physician. The text read 03:14 a.m. The breath caught in my throat. The stagnant air in the break room suddenly felt charged with static electricity. The numbers were not a coincidence. The hands on the pocket watch had not jammed due to mechanical failure. Beatrice had intentionally set the dial. She had died exactly at 3:14 in the morning, meaning she had orchestrated the time on the watch long before her heart stopped beating. The revelation sent a sharp electric jolt down my spine. The Chekhov's gun, loaded and mounted during my isolation in the freezing Audi, had just fired. My grandmother did not leave me a nautical metaphor. She left me a map. I gripped the heavy silver casing in my left hand and pressed the pad of my right thumb against the smooth back plate. I examined the outer edge, searching the tarnished metal. Near the winding stem, obscured by a layer of dark oxidation, I felt a tiny, almost microscopic indentation. I pressed my thumbnail hard into the groove. The solid silver plate shifted. I applied a sudden, sharp pressure, twisting my grip. The metal groaned, emitting a faint squeak. The back plate popped open on a hidden hinge, swinging away from the main housing of the instrument. I pulled the circular plate wide, revealing the complex, interlocking brass gears of the watch's interior. But the gears were not the prize. Nestled inside a shallow, hollowed-out cavity resting directly against the frozen mechanism lay a small, flat object wrapped in a thin piece of wax paper. My heart hammered against my ribs, pumping fresh adrenaline through my exhausted veins. I carefully extracted the wax paper and unfolded the crinkled edges. A small silver key dropped onto the counter landing with a sharp, definitive clink. The metal was stamped with a distinct 4-digit number and the faded, unmistakable logo of a prominent regional bank located right here in Annapolis. It was the exact same commercial banking institution where my father had forged the $250,000 loan. Beatrice possessed a terrifying strategic clarity regarding her own son. She knew Richard would attack my character, accuse her of dementia, and attempt to bulldoze the historic marina the moment her lungs gave out. She prepared a hidden vault of ammunition, knowing I would eventually need undeniable proof to survive the legal war he would wage. Silas stared at the silver key resting on the laminate counter. A slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. The weary resignation he carried moments ago vanished entirely. He checked his wristwatch. The hands indicated it was 20 minutes to 5 in the afternoon. The bank closed precisely at 5 o'clock. Silas grabbed the silver key, shoved it into his pocket, and ordered me to move. We sprinted out of the neutral law firm, the looming threat of the legal injunction injecting a fierce, frantic energy into my tired legs. We rushed down the carpeted hallway, bypassing the elevators, and took the stairs, 2 at a time. We burst through the heavy glass lobby doors and hit the brick sidewalks of downtown Annapolis at a dead run. The regional bank branch was located 3 blocks away, housed inside a grand, imposing stone building adorned with heavy iron grates. The afternoon sky was darkening, threatening another wave of freezing coastal rain. My work boots pounded against the pavement. The blistering pain in my hands and the burning ache in my lungs faded into white noise. I was moving entirely on instinct. We reached the imposing wooden doors of the bank with exactly 3 minutes to spare. A uniformed security guard was already reaching for the deadbolt, preparing to lock the entrance for the evening. Silas intercepted him, flashing his thick leather wallet containing his Bar Association credentials and the certified executor paperwork tied to the Beatrice Martin estate. The veteran attorney utilized his commanding, gravelly voice to full effect, leaving no room for bureaucratic delays. He demanded immediate access to the high-security vault located in the basement, citing urgent, court-ordered legal business. The guard hesitated, intimidated by the sheer aggressive force of Silas's demand. He stepped aside, allowing us into the quiet, marble-floored lobby. A senior bank manager wearing a pristine navy suit hurried over to intercept us. Silas presented the silver key and the corresponding 4-digit number. The manager reviewed the executor documents, verifying my legal standing as the sole trustee. He nodded curtly, leading us past the teller stations and toward a heavy, reinforced steel door at the back of the building. We descended a short flight of carpeted stairs into the subterranean vault. The air down here felt cool, dry, and entirely separated from the chaos of the city above. The walls were lined with thousands of identical metal lockboxes. The manager stopped in front of a specific column, sliding a master key into the upper keyhole of a long rectangular box. He stepped back, gesturing for me to complete the process. My raw, blistered fingers trembled as I took the small silver key Silas handed me. I slid the metal into the lower lock. The mechanism engaged perfectly. I turned my wrist, feeling the heavy, satisfying clunk of the tumblers releasing. The manager pulled the long metal drawer free from the wall, setting it onto a small private viewing table in the center of the room. He informed us we had exactly 10 minutes before the vault secured its automated time locks for the night, then turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Silas and me alone in the silent, windowless space. I stood in front of the metal box, the air catching in my throat. This was the culmination of Beatrice's hidden plan. The lid of the lockbox felt heavy under my touch. I gripped the cold steel edge and pulled it open, desperate to see what kind of arsenal my grandmother had buried in the dark to save my life. The heavy steel lid of the lockbox hinged backward, emitting a low scrape of metal against metal. Inside the dark, narrow container lay the answers I had spent the last agonizing week searching for. The space did not hold stacks of crisp currency, negotiable bonds, or precious jewels. The air rising from the steel drawer carried the distinct, dry scent of preserved paper and old leather. To a luxury developer or a country club investor, the contents would look like worthless debris. To a historical archivist, it looked like a treasure trove. I reached inside my blistered fingers, brushing against the top item. It was a thick, heavy diary. The cover consisted of dark brown weathered leather, the corners softened and worn smooth by years of constant handling. I recognized the binding immediately. Beatrice used these exact logbooks to track the incoming commercial fishing vessels and diesel fuel inventory at her marina. She was a woman who lived her entire life by the ledger, documenting every transaction down to the penny. I pulled the heavy book from the box and set it onto the viewing table. The spine creaked as I opened the cover. My grandmother had applied her meticulous, unyielding accounting skills to her own son. The pages were filled with her neat, disciplined handwriting, utilizing black ink that never smudged. I turned the crisp pages, my eyes scanning the paragraphs. This was not a sentimental diary filled with reflections on the weather or coastal sunsets. It was a ruthless, chronological catalog of emotional abuse and financial manipulation spanning 5 full years. Beatrice had recorded every single instance Richard attempted to exploit her. She documented specific dates, exact times, and verbatim quotes. I stopped on a page dated 3 years prior. The entry detailed a Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Richard had arrived unannounced, smelling of expensive scotch, demanding she leverage the coastal acreage to bail out his sinking luxury boat dealership. Beatrice noted her refusal. She then transcribed his exact retaliation. She wrote that Richard threatened to declare her incompetent and force her into a state-run care facility if she did not surrender the deed. I turned another page, finding an entry from just 8 months ago. Beatrice detailed a phone call where Evelyn screamed at her for refusing to fund a lavish yacht club gala, calling my grandmother a stubborn, senile relic. The ledger provided an unbroken timeline of predatory behavior. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Beatrice understood exactly who her son was. She saw through his tailored suits and recognized the desperate, hollow core of his corporate vanity. This leather-bound book was a lethal weapon. It dismantled the lie that she was an isolated, confused victim. It portrayed a sharp, vigilant matriarch quietly building an impenetrable case against her own flesh and blood. I set the diary aside, my pulse drumming a steady, thumping rhythm in my ears. I reached back into the metal drawer and retrieved the second item. It was a thick manila envelope, sealed with a red wax stamp. I broke the wax, sliding a stack of crisp, stark white documents out onto the table. The letterhead belonged to a highly prestigious neurology clinic located in Baltimore, an institution entirely disconnected from the Annapolis social circles my parents influenced. I scanned the top sheet. It was an independent, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. I checked the date printed near the top margin. The assessment had been conducted a mere 14 days before Beatrice suffered her fatal heart attack. The attending physician had administered a grueling battery of cognitive tests. I read the final summary paragraph, the medical terminology jumping off the page. The specialist concluded that Beatrice Martin exhibited exceptional memory recall, pristine executive function, and uncompromised judgment. The doctor explicitly stated there were 0 indicators of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any age-related cognitive decline. To finalize the armor, a licensed notary public had stamped and signed the bottom of the evaluation, verifying the identity and lucidity of the patient. Harrison, the ruthless litigator who had cornered me during the deposition, had built his entire legal strategy around the concept of a frail delusional mind. He intended to walk into the injunction hearing tomorrow and present a fabricated narrative of senility. The crisp document resting under my raw fingertips would turn his predatory strategy into dust. It obliterated the smear campaign before the judge could even strike a gavel. I let out a shaky breath, the crushing weight of the past few weeks beginning to lift. We had the evidence. We had the timeline. But Beatrice was a woman who never left a job half-finished. She always drove the final nail deep into the wood. I looked into the bottom of the lockbox. Resting against the cold steel was a small black rectangular object. It was a standard USB flash drive. Silas Montgomery stepped forward. He did not say a word. He unlatched his battered leather briefcase, retrieving a thin, modern laptop. He set the computer onto the viewing table, flipped the screen open, and inserted the black drive into the side port. The sterile glow of the monitor illuminated the dark, windowless vault, casting long shadows against the reinforced walls. The file directory opened, displaying a single high-definition video file. Silas clicked the trackpad. The media player launched. The screen flickered, and then my grandmother's face filled the frame. She sat in a well-lit, neutral office environment. A large digital clock on the wall behind her displayed the current date and time, ensuring the recording could never be challenged. Beside her sat an independent legal witness. Beatrice looked physically frail. The illness taking its toll on her lungs was evident in the shallow rise and fall of her chest. But her eyes were bright, fierce, and undeniably sharp. She looked directly into the camera lens, her gaze piercing through the digital recording. Her voice echoed from the small laptop speakers, carrying that familiar, grounded coastal cadence. She began by stating her full legal name. She then systematically laid out her final intentions with clinical precision. Beatrice spoke into the camera and declared her explicit intent to disinherit Richard entirely. She cited his toxic business practices, his lack of moral character, and his overt plans to pave over the historic Maryland shoreline for a quick corporate profit. Then she delivered the killing blow. Beatrice leaned closer to the lens. She stated clearly, without a single tremor of hesitation, that she possessed full knowledge of the commercial loan attached to her marina. She announced on the official recording that she never authorized the debt. She named Richard as the sole orchestrator of the forged signatures. She acknowledged the $250,000 fraud, unmasking his secret financial ruin for the public record. Finally, her harsh expression softened. A genuine, profound warmth entered her eyes. She spoke my name. She detailed my quiet resilience, my dedication to the historical archives, and the calloused work ethic she recognized in my spirit. She told the camera she was leaving the entire 40-acre estate and the operational trust exclusively to me, trusting I would protect the land from the vultures circling the harbor. The video ended, the screen faded to a silent, static black. I stood in the subterranean vault, staring at the empty monitor. My vision blurred. A hot, stinging pressure built behind my eyes. I brought my blistered hands to my face, burying my mouth against my cracked knuckles. A ragged sob tore through my chest. The tears spilled over my eyelashes, cutting tracks down my cheeks. They were not tears of exhaustion, fear, or despair. They were tears of profound, overwhelming vindication. The isolation I had endured since the nor'easter vanished. I felt the powerful, invisible weight of my grandmother's protection wrapping around me, reaching across the impossible distance of the grave to shield me from the storm. She had planned this defense long before I even knew I was under attack. She loved me enough to wage war on my behalf. Silas Montgomery closed the laptop, a quiet click echoing in the vault. He carefully gathered the heavy leather diary, the crisp medical evaluation, and the black flash drive, sliding the entire arsenal into his leather briefcase. He secured the brass clasps, the sound finalizing our preparation. The heavy reinforced steel door at the top of the stairs rattled. The bank manager knocked twice, calling down to inform us the automated time locks were initiating in 60 seconds. I lowered my hands, wiping the salt water from my face. I took a deep, steadying breath. The freezing rain, the industrial bleach, the cruel deposition, and the sheer terror of the ticking foreclosure clock still existed. The bank still demanded their $250,000, but the dynamic of the war had violently flipped. I was no longer a hunted, destitute target dodging blows in the dark. I possessed absolute, undeniable proof of my father's perjury and fraud. I looked at Silas. The veteran attorney gave a short, rigid nod. We turned away from the empty metal lockbox and walked up the carpeted stairs toward the lobby. We were stepping back into the harsh Annapolis evening, ready to walk into the county courthouse tomorrow morning. My father believed he was showing up to a routine injunction hearing to secure his stolen prize. He had no idea he was walking blindfolded into a flawless, inescapable slaughter. The heavy mahogany doors of the Anne Arundel County Courthouse swung open at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning. I walked into the crowded gallery, the distinct smell of lemon oil and old paper mixing with the nervous tension in the room. I did not wear the thin morning dress from the funeral. I wore dark, heavy denim and a sturdy canvas jacket, standard archivist attire. I made no effort to hide the raw, peeling blisters on my hands. I sat beside Silas Montgomery at the defense table, ignoring the harsh fluorescent lighting that highlighted the dark circles under my eyes. Across the center aisle, Richard and Evelyn occupied the plaintiff's table. Harrison, the ruthless corporate litigator, flanked them, arranging thick leather portfolios with practiced efficiency. Richard wore a fresh navy blue suit that projected total, unbared confidence. Evelyn sat straight-backed, checking her immaculate reflection in the screen of her phone. I noticed the brilliant glint of blue near her jawline. She was wearing Beatrice's vintage sapphire earrings again, treating the courtroom like a country club gala. They did not glance in my direction. They assumed the battle was already won. The transcript of my screaming outbursts during the deposition had been entered into the official record. They believed I was walking into the chamber unarmed, exhausted, and ready to be legally dismantled. The presiding judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested he had witnessed decades of bitter family infighting, called the injunction hearing to order. His gavel struck the wooden block, a sharp, defining crack that silenced the gallery. Harrison wasted no time launching his offensive. He stood up and called Richard to the witness stand. My father walked past the bailiff, placed his hand on a worn Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He took his seat in the wooden box, adjusting the crease in his trousers. He faced the judge, deploying a flawless, calculated performance. He did not sound angry or demanding. He utilized a soft, measured tone, playing the role of a heartbroken son burdened by tragic circumstances. Harrison guided him through the fabricated narrative. The lawyer asked Richard to describe his mother's final months. Richard leaned forward, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. He testified under oath that Beatrice suffered a rapid, catastrophic mental decline. He claimed she spent her days wandering the historic marina, confused and terrified, unable to recognize the faces of her own family members. He stated with absolute certainty that his mother could not even remember her own name during the last few weeks of her life. The dramatic irony filling the courtroom was suffocating. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the defense table, savoring the spectacle. Every single word spilling from my father's mouth tightened the noose around his own neck. He was confidently digging his own grave, piling perjury upon perjury, entirely unaware that the shovel he used was about to snap in half. He moved on to assassinate my character. Richard testified that I had isolated his fragile mother, exploiting her dementia, to force the creation of the irrevocable trust. He expressed deep paternal sorrow over my current state, citing my homelessness and my erratic outbursts during the deposition as definitive proof that I required immediate psychiatric intervention. He asked the judge to strip my trustee rights and grant him control of the coastal estate, claiming it was the only way to save both his mother's legacy and his daughter's sanity. Harrison concluded his direct examination, leaving a heavy, sympathetic silence in the chamber. He returned to his seat, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He believed he had just delivered a masterclass in litigation. The judge turned his attention to our table, peering over the top of his reading glasses. He asked Silas if he wished to cross-examine the witness. Silas Montgomery stood up. He buttoned his faded tweed jacket, projecting a calm, weathered authority. He did not carry a legal pad or a list of prepared questions. He walked to the center podium, carrying the battered leather briefcase we had filled inside the bank vault. "Your Honor, the defense waives the cross-examination of Mr. Martin," Silas stated, his rough voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. A confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard blinked, exchanging a quick, surprised glance with Harrison. Waiving the cross-examination is a highly unusual tactic. The litigator assumed we were surrendering, accepting the fabricated narrative without a fight. However, Silas continued cutting off the murmur. The defense would like to introduce 3 pieces of evidence into the official court record, effectively demonstrating the plaintiff's blatant disregard for the perjury statutes of this state. The smugness evaporated from Harrison's face. He sat forward, his predatory instincts flaring. Silas approached the bench. He handed the judge a sealed manila envelope. He announced he was submitting a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by an independent Baltimore neurology clinic exactly 14 days before Beatrice passed away. The evaluation explicitly confirms Beatrice Martin possessed pristine executive function and 0 indicators of cognitive decline. Silas informed the court. The document is notarized and signed by a licensed physician, directly contradicting the plaintiff's sworn testimony that she could not remember her own name. Harrison jumped out of his leather chair, shouting a frantic objection, attempting to block the admission of the medical report on procedural grounds. The judge ignored him. The older man pulled the crisp document from the envelope, reading the medical summary. His brow furrowed, his expression darkening, as he processed the unyielding conclusion of the neurologist. But Silas was already signaling the court bailiff. A tall metal cart holding a large television monitor was rolled into the center aisle. Silas plugged the black flash drive into the side of the display. He announced he was submitting a time-stamped video recording, authenticated by an independent notary public. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom fell dead silent. Beatrice's face appeared on the large monitor. Her image illuminated the wood-paneled chamber. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes sharp and focused. Her voice, raspy but carrying undeniable authority, echoed off the high ceilings. She systematically dismantled her son's entire fabricated reality. She named Richard a predator. She detailed his relentless greed and his explicit intentions to bulldoze her historic marina for a quick corporate profit. The atmosphere in the courtroom whiplashed. The smug confidence vanished entirely from the plaintiff's table. Harrison sank back into his chair, realizing his entire case was built on a perjury trap he could not escape. Then Beatrice delivered the final, devastating blow. On the recording, she declared her explicit knowledge of the $250,000 commercial loan. She stated she never authorized the debt and named Richard as the sole orchestrator of the forged signatures. She unmasked his secret financial ruin, exposing a federal banking crime for the official court record. Richard sat frozen in the witness box. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. The flawless corporate vanity he spent decades cultivating shattered under the weight of the public rejection. He stared at the monitor, his chest heaving, unable to process the terrifying reality that his own mother had outmaneuvered him from the grave. He was no longer a grieving son. He was a cornered felon. Evelyn reacted with a sharp, ragged gasp. The rigid perfection of her posture collapsed. The realization that her carefully constructed lifestyle was built on a crumbling foundation hit her nervous system like a freight train. She brought a shaking hand to her chest, swaying violently to the left. She lost her balance completely and slumped heavily against the wooden divider of the plaintiff's table. As her head struck the polished wood, the heavy silver clasp of the vintage sapphire earring snapped. The stolen jewel slipped loose. It hit the floorboards with a sharp click, bouncing across the center aisle of the courtroom. The blue gemstone rolled over the carpet, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch away from the toe of my mud-stained work boot. It was the ultimate symbol of the power transfer. The stolen prize rested at the feet of the actual heir. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the gallery. He glared down at Richard, his expression twisting into deep, unmistakable disgust. He did not hesitate. The judge threw out the emergency injunction with extreme prejudice, citing overwhelming evidence of fraud and perjury on the part of the plaintiff. He formally reaffirmed my status as the sole, undisputed trustee of the Beatrice Martin Irrevocable Trust. He then instructed the court clerk to forward the hearing transcripts directly to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. I won the courtroom war. The vicious smear campaign was obliterated. I possessed the clean, unencumbered legal title to a multi-million-dollar coastal estate. I sat in my chair, exhaling a shaky, ragged breath, expecting to feel a soaring, victorious vindication. Instead, Silas packed his briefcase, his face grim and unsmiling. He leaned over, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, pulling me into the quiet hallway outside the chamber. The attorney delivered a crushing reality check. The legal victory was undeniable, but the immediate financial reality was a hollow, ticking time bomb. The regional bank held a signed contract attached to the property deed. Proving the signature was forged and untangling a federal fraud case would take years of slow, agonizing civil litigation. The ruthless commercial lending officers did not care about my father's impending perjury charges. They only cared about the delinquent account. Silas looked me in the eye and laid out the terrifying timeline. The judicial hold on the estate was lifted, which meant the foreclosure clock resumed its countdown. I possessed the legal title to a waterfront empire, but I still had exactly 14 days to hand the bank a certified check for $250,000. If I missed the deadline by a single minute, the bank would seize the property, auction it to the luxury developers waiting in the wings, and saddle me with the remaining debt. I had survived the courtroom slaughter, only to find myself standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down a ticking clock with empty pockets. The ultimate battle was just beginning. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind me, cutting off the chaotic murmurs of the gallery and the sight of my father staring blankly at the witness stand. The corridor outside stretched long and empty, lined with cold marble and illuminated by rows of humming fluorescent bulbs. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the injunction hearing began to recede, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. My knees trembled slightly. My raw hands ached where I gripped the official court decree, confirming my status as the sole trustee of the Beatrice Martin estate. I looked down at the crisp paper. The embossed seal of the county clerk rested in the bottom corner. It was tangible proof of my victory. I had defeated a vicious smear campaign, exposed a federal crime, and secured my grandmother's legacy. I expected the crushing pressure in my chest to evaporate. I expected to feel the clean, unburdened relief of a survivor standing at the end of a long war. Instead, Silas Montgomery walked out of the chamber, his expression devoid of any celebratory warmth. He carried his battered leather briefcase, the brass clasps catching the harsh overhead light. The veteran attorney did not offer a smile. He did not offer a handshake. He stopped a few feet away, his weathered face set in lines of grim, unyielding pragmatism. He told me the fight inside that wood-paneled room was merely a skirmish. The true enemy was still waiting outside the courthouse walls. Silas guided me toward a wooden bench resting against the marble corridor wall. We sat down. The echo of distant footsteps drifted through the empty hallway. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and delivered a gut-wrenching reality check that shattered my brief illusion of safety. He explained the unforgiving, sterile machinery of the American commercial banking system. We had secured a definitive legal ruling. The judge had thrown out the injunction, and the district attorney would likely pursue perjury and fraud charges against Richard. But criminal justice operates on an agonizingly slow timeline. Untangling a federal bank fraud case, gathering corporate subpoenas, and navigating the endless appeals process takes 3 to 5 years of civil litigation. The justice system is a labyrinth of delays and procedural motions. The regional lending institution holding the note on the historic marina did not care about procedural motions. A commercial bank does not possess a heartbeat or a moral compass. It operates on algorithms, quarterly earnings, and delinquent ledgers. Silas laid out the mechanics of the trap. The $250,000 equity line of credit Richard forged was a secured debt. It was tethered directly to the physical dirt of the 40-acre coastal estate. The bank did not care whose signature sat on the dotted line, nor did they care that the orchestrator of the loan was facing indictment. They only cared that the asset securing the funds was deeply in default. The judicial hold placed on the property during the probate dispute had officially lifted the moment the judge struck his gavel. The protective shield was gone. The foreclosure clock had resumed its countdown. Silas turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He stated the terrifying parameters of my victory. I possessed the clean, unencumbered legal title to a pristine waterfront empire. Yet, I had exactly 14 days to hand a lending officer a certified cashier's check for $250,000. If I failed to cure the delinquency by that specific deadline, the bank would execute their legal right to seize the deed. The cruelty of the situation crashed over me, a suffocating wave of systemic injustice. I looked at my cracked, peeling fingers. I was 24 years old. I spent my nights wearing brine-soaked rubber overalls, scraping toxic marine paint off commercial trawlers, just to afford a cup of coffee and a tank of gas. I was sleeping in a rusted sedan smelling of industrial bleach. Earning $250,000 in 2 weeks through manual labor was a mathematical delusion. I asked Silas about traditional financing. I suggested we use the court decree to prove my ownership and secure a new, legitimate mortgage to pay off the fraudulent balance. The attorney shook his head, dismantling the idea before I could even finish the sentence. He reminded me of the secondary twist Richard had engineered. My childhood Social Security number was still attached to the defaulted commercial loan. The false elder abuse report my father filed with the state authorities still cast a shadow over my personal banking profile. My credit history was frozen, flagged, and currently associated with a severe financial delinquency. No underwriter in the country would approve a 6-figure mortgage for a young, unemployed archivist with a frozen credit report and zero liquid capital. Walking into a bank branch and asking for $250,000 would only result in a swift, algorithmic rejection. I was trapped in a flawless financial catch-22. I had beaten my abusive father. I had reclaimed my reputation. But I was about to lose everything to the cold, indifferent machinery of the banking system. Silas added the final sickening variable to the equation. The auction scheduled for the end of the 14-day window was merely a formality. The luxury developer, the man in the yellow windbreaker who had circled Beatrice's grave during the nor'easter, had never left the harbor. He was waiting in the shadows, his corporate holding company armed with boundless liquid capital. He had established a line of communication with the bank's foreclosure department. If the clock struck 0, the bank would transfer the deed to the developer for pennies on the dollar, eager to clear the bad debt from their ledgers. The developer would secure the coveted 40 acres, bulldoze the historic marina, pave over the ancient oyster beds, and erect a sterile monolith of waterfront condominiums. Beatrice's legacy would be erased forever, replaced by the exact country club vanity she despised. Worse, the bank would hold me liable for any remaining deficiency balance, chaining my future wages to a loan I never signed. The silence of the marble corridor pressed against my ringing ears. The sheer magnitude of the obstacle felt insurmountable. I had climbed a towering mountain, only to find a sheer cliff waiting on the other side. The despair began to pull me under. I stared at the pristine court order in my lap, realizing a piece of paper held no value against a ticking corporate clock. I closed my eyes, the exhaustion threatening to consume my rational thought. I envisioned the developer signing the deed. I pictured the heavy yellow excavators rolling onto the property, tearing down the wooden docks where Beatrice taught me to tie nautical knots. I felt the familiar sting of defeat, the urge to surrender to a system built to protect men like my father. But the image of the mud returned. I opened my eyes, staring down at the scuffed, mud-stained toes of my work boots. The memory of standing in the Chesapeake sludge 14 years ago anchored me. The mud washes off, but selling your soul stains forever. I stopped thinking like a victim of a broken family. I stopped viewing the problem through the lens of a frightened daughter seeking permission from a banking institution. I realized that fighting a commercial bank on their own battlefield was a guaranteed loss. The rules of traditional finance were designed to exclude people like me. I needed to change the rules entirely. I looked at my hands. The calluses were real. The blisters were proof of my endurance. But my true strength did not lie in power-washing boat hulls. It resided in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the university. My expertise was not in high finance. It was in historical preservation. I spent years studying the meticulous details of colonial maritime records, understanding the intrinsic, irreplaceable value of the Maryland coastline. The 40-acre estate was not just a plot of dirt waiting for condominiums. It contained an untouched 18th century shoreline. It was a living, breathing, natural archive. A new radical strategy began to form in my mind. The traditional financial doors were locked, guarded by algorithms and credit scores. I needed to bypass the commercial sector entirely. I needed to approach an entity that valued history over profit margins. I needed an institution equipped with autonomous, liquid capital, capable of moving faster than a bank foreclosure department. I folded the court decree and slipped it into the pocket of my canvas jacket. I looked at Silas, the crushing despair gone from my posture. I told the veteran attorney to draft a highly specific legal contract. I informed him I was going to secure the $250,000, but I was not going to ask a bank for permission. I was going to leverage the very dirt beneath our feet and force a private endowment to buy our survival. The strategy required a profound shift in perspective. I stopped treating the 40-acre estate as a piece of contested real estate and began treating it as an irreplaceable archive. I drove my rattling Honda Civic back to the cramped apartment complex, ignoring the eviction notice still taped to my door. I bypassed my unit entirely and headed straight for the basement storage lockers. During the height of the probate war, I had secured a small, climate-controlled unit to hide my most valuable reference materials. I unlatched the padlock and pulled out 2 heavy, reinforced plastic totes. Inside those bins rested the true wealth of my grandmother's legacy. Beatrice did not just track diesel fuel and slip fees. She had spent 5 decades meticulously documenting the tidal patterns, native oyster populations, and shoreline erosion of her property. Interspersed with her modern ledgers were the fragile, yellowed maritime logs passed down from her own grandfather. I sat on the concrete floor under a flickering fluorescent bulb, sorting through the archaic parchment. My blistered hands moved with practiced archival care. The scent of aged paper and dried salt marsh filled the dim space. I cross-referenced Beatrice's hand-drawn maps with the colonial property lines. The data confirmed what I had long suspected. The jagged stretch of coastline bordering the historic marina was not just old dirt. It was a pristine, untouched remnant of an 18th century deep-water port featuring native marine ecosystems that had been eradicated from the rest of the Chesapeake Bay. To a luxury condo developer, those native oyster beds were obstacles waiting to be paved over with concrete. To an academic institution, they were the holy grail of ecological and historical preservation. I packed the most compelling ledgers into my canvas tote bag and called Silas Montgomery. I instructed him to bypass the commercial banking sector entirely. I needed him to utilize his decades of local influence to secure an emergency audience with the board of directors for the Maryland Heritage Endowment. The endowment was a private, highly selective university trust. They possessed autonomous liquid capital governed not by federal banking algorithms, but by a board of wealthy, cynical historians and retired marine biologists. They existed to protect the coastline, and their operational budget bypassed the slow-moving bureaucracy of state grants. Getting a meeting was notoriously difficult. Getting a meeting within 72 hours was virtually unheard of. But Silas recognized the brilliance of the maneuver. He spent an entire afternoon calling in every professional favor he had cultivated over 30 years of practicing law. 3 days before the foreclosure deadline, I walked into a sleek, modern boardroom overlooking the Annapolis harbor. The environment was a stark departure from the sterile courtroom. The long oak table gleamed under soft, recessed lighting. 5 board members sat opposite me. They wore tailored tweed, expensive spectacles, and the skeptical expressions of gatekeepers accustomed to rejecting desperate pleas for charity. I did not sit down. I did not attempt to elicit their sympathy by recounting my father's cruelty, my impending eviction, or my nights spent scrubbing commercial trawlers. Pity does not open checkbooks. I unzipped my faded canvas bag and carefully laid Beatrice's weathered crabbing logs and the 18th century maritime maps across the polished oak. I invited them to examine the documents. The lead director, a formidable woman with sharp features and silver hair, adjusted her glasses and leaned over the fragile parchment. Her skepticism wavered for a fraction of a second as she recognized the authentic, unbroken chain of historical data. I launched into my pitch, keeping my voice steady and devoid of desperation. I detailed the unique, pristine nature of the 40-acre estate. I explained that the land offered unparalleled access to an untouched colonial shoreline, providing a living laboratory for both marine biology and historical excavation. I stated that acquiring a similar coastal property on the open market would cost their endowment tens of millions of dollars, assuming such a property even existed. Then I laid out my terms. I was not asking for a loan. I was offering a partnership. I demanded an immediate, expedited preservation grant of $250,000. In exchange, I offered the endowment exclusive, perpetual research rights to the shoreline. The board members exchanged guarded glances. A retired professor sitting at the end of the table scoffed, tapping his pen against his notepad. He challenged my authority. He pointed out my youth, my lack of business experience, and the severe ticking clock of the bank foreclosure. He questioned why the endowment should risk $250,000 to bail out a 24-year-old girl. Silas stepped forward, acting as my legal shield. He distributed certified copies of the court decree confirming my status as the sole, undisputed trustee. He provided structural engineering reports Beatrice had commissioned years prior, proving the marina was sound. Silas parried their legal concerns with cold, hard facts, leaving no room for bureaucratic hesitation. I reclaimed the floor, delivering the final, inescapable hook. I introduced the concept of the historical easement. I promised to sign a binding restrictive covenant legally attaching it to the deed of the property. The easement would permanently prohibit any future commercial real estate development. No luxury condominiums, no private yacht clubs, no paved parking lots over the ancient pine forests. The land would be forever locked into its current historical state. The proposal was a brilliantly disguised, poison pill. It aligned perfectly with the endowment's mission of conservation while simultaneously obliterating the business model of the yellow windbreaker developer. The negotiation turned grueling. For 4 agonizing hours, the academics scrutinized every single clause, debating the liability and the unprecedented timeline. I stood my ground, channeling the unyielding grit Beatrice possessed when negotiating with ruthless commercial fishermen. I matched their cynicism with empirical data, refusing to shrink under their intense interrogation. As the sun dipped below the harbor horizon, painting the boardroom in shadows, the lead director closed the final ledger. She looked at me, a profound, hard-earned respect softening her sharp features. She nodded once. The board voted to approve the grant. The following 72 hours blurred into a frantic, sleepless sprint of legal drafting and wire transfers. The endowment's attorneys moved with astonishing speed, eager to secure the rare easement. Silas and I spent our days in a haze of paperwork, verifying the exact routing numbers and transfer protocols required by the regional bank holding the forged debt. The morning of the deadline arrived dark and heavy with a creeping coastal fog. Silas and I sat in the austere lobby of the regional bank, watching the digital clock above the teller station tick downward. We had less than 4 hours before the foreclosure automatically triggered. A lending officer, a stern man carrying a thick file, emerged from the back offices. He wore the impatient expression of an executioner preparing to drop the axe. He sat across from us, stating plainly that the grace period was over. He informed us the secondary buyer, the luxury developer's holding company, had already submitted their preliminary acquisition paperwork. Silas did not argue. He simply slid his laptop across the desk, instructing the officer to refresh his internal clearing system. The lending officer frowned, tapping his keyboard. He stared at his monitor. The color drained from his face as a staggering 7-figure wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve and settled directly into the delinquent commercial account. The $250,000 principal, along with all accumulated penalties and interest, vanished from his ledger. The debt was cured. The ledger read 0. The officer stammered, looking from the screen to my calm expression. He was forced to stamp the foreclosure file closed. He printed a formal certificate of satisfaction, sliding the receipt across the desk. I picked up the paper, the friction of the crisp page rough against my healing blisters. The trap my father built had been dismantled from the inside out. The historical easement was officially filed with the county clerk. The moment that restrictive covenant entered the public record, the pristine coastal property became commercially worthless to anyone seeking to build condominiums. The luxury developers were permanently, legally locked out of the land. They could not touch a single blade of grass. I walked out of the regional bank, stepping into the cool, damp Maryland air. The suffocating weight of the ticking clock finally lifted off my shoulders, leaving behind a soaring, unburdened freedom. I possessed the clean title to my grandmother's sanctuary. The land was safe. But as I stood on the brick sidewalk, watching the harbor boats navigate through the fog, I knew the story was not over. The estate was secure, but the orchestrator of my suffering was still out there. Richard had locked me in a freezing car, destroyed my reputation, and tried to sell my heritage to save his own vanity. It was time to close the circle. It was time to show my father the true cost of his arrogance. The fallout moved with the speed of a falling guillotine. The moment the historical easement entered the county property records, the restricted covenant triggered an immediate chain reaction. The luxury developer, the man in the bright yellow windbreaker who had hovered like a vulture at Beatrice's grave, withdrew his corporate funding within hours. He could not build condominiums on protected ecological land, and he had no interest in funding a disgraced country club patriarch. Without the anticipated multi-million-dollar real estate payout, Richard's financial house of cards collapsed. His luxury boat dealership choked on its own toxic debt. Lenders called in their markers. The gleaming showroom floors were emptied of inventory by repo men holding court orders. By the end of the month, the business filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, shuttering its doors for good. But the financial ruin was merely the prologue to his punishment. The county judge who presided over our injunction hearing made good on his threat. The court clerk had forwarded the hearing transcripts and the digital video file to the district attorney. Federal investigators descended on the regional bank branch. They audited the $250,000 equity line of credit, tracing the forged signatures and the illicit flow of funds directly into Richard's failing dealership. A grand jury handed down a sweeping federal indictment for bank fraud and perjury. My father was stripped of his bespoke suits and forced to surrender his passport. The pending felony charges rendered him entirely unemployable in the corporate sector. His elite network, the men with heavy diving watches and tailored overcoats, severed all ties, treating him like a contagion. The regional banks showed no mercy. They initiated foreclosure proceedings on his pristine Annapolis mansion. Evelyn lost her sprawling gardens and her climate-controlled walk-in closets. My parents were evicted from their own high society life, forced to rent a cramped, drafty two-bedroom apartment situated above a noisy commercial laundromat on the industrial edge of town. There were no more country club galas. There were no more stolen vintage sapphire earrings. My mother spent her morning sitting at a chipped Formica dining table under a flickering overhead bulb, wielding a pair of cheap plastic scissors. She clipped 20-cent discount coupons from the Sunday circulars just to afford canned soup, mourning the opulent lifestyle that had vanished into thin air. 6 months passed. The Maryland winter returned, bringing the familiar biting winds off the Chesapeake Bay. I stood on the wooden docks of the historic marina, watching a team of university graduate students cataloging the native oyster beds. The private endowment provided a steady, robust stream of operational revenue. The estate was thriving, serving as a premier maritime research sanctuary. It was during this prosperous season that I received a notice regarding the final liquidation of Richard's remaining assets. A public auction was scheduled at the commercial docks. The bank was selling off his prized possession to recoup the bankruptcy deficits. It was a 50-foot luxury sport fishing yacht. Richard had loved that vessel. It served as his ultimate status symbol, a floating monument to his arrogance. He used to host lavish cocktail parties on the teak deck, boasting about his corporate dominance while drinking expensive scotch. I attended the auction. I did not hide in the back row. I wore a warm, heavy canvas coat and stood near the front, projecting the calm, grounded authority of a successful estate director. When the auctioneer introduced the pristine yacht, I raised my bidding paddle. I did not hesitate. I engaged in a swift, calculated bidding war against 2 local charter captains. I utilized the operational revenue generated by the Historical Society lease, the very land my father tried to pave over, to outbid everyone in the harbor. I secured the winning bid, purchasing the luxury vessel outright. I hired Silas Montgomery one last time to draft a highly specific, non-negotiable commercial lease. Richard was destitute. He faced mounting legal bills for his federal defense and possessed 0 income. He was starving, trapped in a drafty apartment with a wife who resented his failure. His only remaining marketable skill was his deep working knowledge of the local coastal waterways. Silas presented the contract to my father. It was an employment agreement. The man who had locked me inside a freezing Audi, who had viewed the calloused hands of the local fishermen with unvarnished disgust, was forced to sign his name on the dotted line. He became my tenant and my direct employee. I retrofitted the luxury sport fishing yacht, stripping away the plush leather seating and the polished teak bars. I converted the vessel into a heavy-duty commercial crabbing boat. To seal the poetic justice of his new reality, I hired a local painter to change the name on the stern. Before Richard stepped onto the deck for his first official shift, the painter brushed a new title across the fiberglass hull in stark, bold lettering. I renamed the boat Beatrice's Karma. Every single morning, long before the sun crested the horizon, Richard was forced to wake up in the freezing darkness. He drove to the commercial docks, pulling on stiff, brine-soaked rubber overalls and heavy waterproof boots. He stepped onto the deck of a vessel legally owned by the daughter he tried to ruin. He spent his days enduring the biting Atlantic wind whipping across his exposed face. His hands, once soft and manicured, grew blistered, cracked, and stained with diesel fuel and rotten bait. He hauled heavy wire crab pots over the gunwale, his lungs burning, performing the exact back-breaking manual labor he had forced upon me during my exile at the shipyard. Every time he looked at the stern, he was forced to read the name of the mother he betrayed. He was trapped in an endless loop of grueling physical debt, working as a blue-collar deckhand just to survive. I watched him from the warmth of the historic marina, feeling a quiet, profound resolution settle into my bones. The circle was closed. We live in an era where the American dream has, for many, fractured into a desperate race for optical perfection. We measure the success of a household by the prestige of the zip code, the polished holiday cards, the curated digital updates, and the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. But beneath this glossy veneer, a quiet spiritual decay often takes root in the very heart of the traditional family. When parents prioritize the applause of strangers over the emotional safety of their own children, they sever the most sacred bond of trust. A home must be cultivated as a sanctuary where emotional truth is valued far above public perception. When a mother or father views a child's genuine grief or vulnerability as a liability to their social standing, they do not forge strong adults. They forge emotionally fractured individuals who will either explode under the pressure or build impenetrable walls to survive the cold. My parents were consumed by the idolatry of the ego. They equated human worth with financial leverage. They were willing to bulldoze history, exploit a dying matriarch, and sacrifice their own daughter just to protect their fragile pride. But true wealth is never found behind the tinted windows of a luxury vehicle or in the forced smiles of a yacht club gala. True legacy resides in the quiet dignity of an honest day of work. It is built on the unyielding strength to protect your boundaries against those who seek to exploit your empathy. It is found in the calloused hands of a grandmother who patches her own roof and writes the truth in a weathered ledger. If you plant seeds of deceit, control, and cruelty, you will inevitably harvest a bitter, isolated winter. The energy you pour into the world will always return to your doorstep. But if you hold the line, if you refuse to trade your grit for a hollow, easy life, you will cultivate an internal compass that can guide you through the darkest storms. As you navigate your own complex family dynamics, release the desperate need to mold yourself to fit a toxic narrative. Protect your peace with ironclad boundaries. The mud will always wash off your hands, but your integrity is the one asset no one can ever foreclose on. When the harsh winds rattle the windows of your life, the survivors are never the ones who hid behind a polished facade. The survivors are the ones who learned how to read the map, weather the freezing rain, and keep their own light burning in the dark. Take a moment to picture a typical, affluent American neighborhood at dusk. The manicured lawns perfectly edge the glowing windows, framing warm living rooms, the expensive vehicles resting quietly in the driveways. From the sidewalk, it is the very portrait of the American dream, a testament to hard work, stability, and success. Yet as the story of Arianne and her family so brutally illustrates, the facade of a house tells us absolutely nothing about the temperature of the home inside. We live in a culture that exerts an immense, invisible pressure on parents to project optical perfection. We are conditioned to measure our family's worth by external milestones, the prestige of a university decal on the back window, the zip code of our residence, the curated smiles on an annual holiday card. But when the pursuit of this pristine image supersedes the emotional reality of the people living within those walls, a quiet, devastating spiritual decay takes root. Consider the chilling image of a father locking his grieving daughter inside a freezing car because her tears threatened to embarrass him in front of his wealthy peers. Richard Martin did not wake up one morning and decide to become a villain. He was slowly consumed by the idolatry of the ego. He began to view his own child not as a beating heart entrusted to his care, but as a public relations liability. This is the profound danger of raising children without emotional awareness. In a healthy, traditional family structure, the home must serve as a sanctuary. It is the one place on earth where a child should be allowed to take off their armor. When children cry when they stumble, when they express fear or raw vulnerability, They are testing the structural integrity of their parents' love. If a parent punishes that vulnerability, if they demand stoicism to protect their own social standing, they sever the most sacred bond of trust. They teach the child that love is strictly transactional, entirely conditional upon their performance. Children raised in this environment of emotional starvation do not magically outgrow the damage. They learn to survive it. They either internalize the shame crumbling under the impossible weight of perfection, or they forge impenetrable walls of ice, learning to view the world with the same cold, calculating distance their parents modeled. Richard traded his daughter's enduring trust for a fleeting handshake from a yacht club investor. In doing so, he bankrupted his family's soul long before his commercial dealership ever collapsed. This brings us to the profound responsibility of long-term guidance and the true definition of a family legacy. Beatrice, the matriarch who waged war from the grave, understood what her son did not. She recognized that shielding a child from the dirt of the world does them no favors. She took a young Arianne down to the shoreline, put her in the thick black mud of the Chesapeake Bay, and taught her how to work. Beatrice understood that parenting is not about paving an easy, frictionless road for the next generation. It is about handing them an internal compass calibrated to honesty, fairness, and grit. She taught her granddaughter that the mud of an honest day's labor washes off, but the stain of selling your